Hey guys, tonight we begin with the question, what if you served Xerxes the Great? Gold, silence, and orders that echoed louder than drums. One breath too loud, and history might swallow you. So, while you're getting comfortable, feel free to tap like and subscribe if this kind of calm, late-night history is your thing. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it was when you pressed play. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the deep thud of the morning bell. It sounds low and heavy, as if struck inside your own chest. It rolls through the servant quarters like a warning, reverberating off the limestone walls and settling into your bones before your eyes even open. The room around you is dark, but already warm. The desert air clinging to the stone floor and thickening with each exhale from your fellow attendants. No one speaks. No one needs to. The bell is the only conversation that matters, and it means you have fewer than 10 minutes to be dressed, washed, and moving toward the hall. Your feet hit the floor with practiced hesitation. The reed mat beneath you is rough from wear, and the cold jug of water near your cot holds just enough for a quick rinse. You brace yourself for the chill and pour it over your head. It's not refreshing, just expected. Your tunic is already laid out beside you, folded with care the night before. If it's creased, someone notices. If someone notices, they report it. If they report it, you might find yourself reassigned to a latrine crew, or worse, the kitchens. Nobody comes back from the kitchens in the same condition. By the time you're threading through the narrow servant corridor behind the eastern wing, the sun hasn't yet breached the hills. But you can feel its promise pushing at the edge of the horizon, like a child pressing against a curtain. There's the smell of sandalwood oil in the air, spilled maybe, or deliberately smeared along the walls to purify the path. The others walk in single file, carrying trays, linens, combs, incense, and pots of paint. One girl is already crying silently. That usually means she was chosen for something. No one ever says what, and she won't be coming back with the rest of the procession. At the turn where the hallway meets the marble threshold of the inner court, you slow down. Everyone does. There's a small moment here where the light catches in a particular way, diffused through the latticework above. It paints golden patterns across the floor, and though no one admits it aloud, it feels like a test. You never step on the same square twice. You hold your breath, and if you're lucky, your shadow behaves. The hall of morning rituals is nearly silent when you enter, except for the faint brush of brooms and the squeak of polished bronze. Statues of lions and griffins line the perimeter, their eyes always just above your head. You're not allowed to look directly at them. Or maybe you are. The rules shift daily, depending on who's watching and what mood the stewards woke up in. You keep your eyes low and follow the person in front of you, measuring each step, each pivot, until you reach your assigned post behind the tall screen near the incense brazier. Everything you touch here smells of oil and heat. The cloth used to wipe the vessels must be folded inward, so no human skin makes contact with the sacred metal. You're not sure why. You're not supposed to ask. A scribe once whispered that the king's ancestors had declared the bronze to be alive. Another said it was just because the priests didn't want to explain fingerprints. Either way, you polish with the care of someone who knows their entire future hangs on the angle of a reflection. In the distance, you can hear the shuffle of the royal guard changing shifts. Their armor doesn't clink, it murmurs. The effect is disorienting, like listening to coins being poured underwater. A signal is given. It's not a trumpet, not exactly. More like a short, sharp whistle from somewhere above. That means the king is stirring. You step back as a eunuch glides past you, his robe as silent as smoke. His glance doesn't linger, but you feel the weight of it all the same. You've passed inspection, for now. You adjust your sleeves and take another steadying breath. The air is thick with frankincense now, curling in long tendrils that almost seem to search the room for disobedience. In moments, you'll be summoned deeper into the private chambers, where the king will expect every item to be in its place, every candle trimmed to the right length, every goblet turned just so. Your hands twitch with the memory of past corrections, gentle when you're lucky, public when you're not. You've never spoken to him, of course. That's not how things work here. But you felt the shape of his presence, heavy as a thundercloud in summer. When he enters, the room changes pressure. And yet, all you'll be allowed to do is kneel, adjust what you're told to adjust, and disappear before the sound of his sandals fades. The more invisible you are, the longer you last. The longer you last, the more likely it is you'll be trusted with delicate tasks, like laying out the ritual paint, or selecting the correct silver bowl for the king's morning wash. You hear your name called, not shouted, just spoken firmly by someone you don't see. That means it's your turn to step through the doorway and into the preparation chamber. Your palms are already sweating, but you keep your grip steady as you gather the items from the tray beside you. You know the sequence. You've practiced it in your sleep. And yet, every day feels like the first time you've done it. The doors ahead open, not with grandeur, but with purpose. You step forward, eyes lowered, hands full of silk, oils, and ash. Today, the king will see you, or at least the results of your work. He'll examine the room through half-lidded eyes, as if searching for something no one else can name. And if anything is wrong, even slightly, you won't be the one to explain it. You'll just be the one blamed. But for now, the room awaits. And every fold of linen, every pinch of powder, must be exactly right before the king's gaze sweeps through. After all, the rituals matter more than the people performing them, which means your only real chance of survival is mastering the performance. And that performance continues just beyond this doorway, where the day begins with ritual offerings and ends with silence. The moment your bare feet touch the cool stone of the preparation chamber, your thoughts vanish. Not out of panic, but habit, survival. You've learned to stop thinking in this room. Thinking leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to mistakes. This is not a place for interpretation or invention. It is a place for execution, repetition, and perfection. The walls here are high and smooth, made of polished limestone that traps the early light and reflects it in soft, indifferent angles. There is no echo, no breeze, and no scent save for the lingering perfume of cedarwood oil and the faint mineral smell of water left in bronze. The silence is curated. No one speaks unless spoken to, and even then, words are reduced to gestures, nods, eye flicks, the careful tap of a fingernail against a polished jar. You move toward your station, a small alcove marked only by a pattern of tiles on the floor, 4 green and 1 black in the center. It's there that you kneel and open the lacquered case before you. Inside is the morning set. Silver bowls, precisely stacked. 1 for the hand-washing ritual, 1 for the eye salve, 1 for the incense cones. They must be in that order, and even the angle of their reflection must point toward the sacred flame that flickers in the central brazier. That's not superstition, that's protocol. To your left, another servant carefully lays out sandals, 4 pairs, each slightly different in size and color, as the king decides each morning which mood suits which soul. He never wears the same pair 2 days in a row, but sometimes he chooses one and asks why it was placed first. The correct answer is never, "I thought you'd like it." The correct answer is silence, just enough to suggest you understand without presuming anything at all. You lift each bowl with 2 hands and polish it once more, though it has already been polished 3 times before dawn. You're not polishing the bowl. You're polishing your fear. The rim of each one is checked for the tiniest blemish, a spot where silver might have worn thin or caught a fingerprint. You hold it under the lamplight at 5 different angles, your breath shallow. The king doesn't often complain about bowls, but when he does, someone disappears for a week, then returns with a new limp or a new position, tending the royal stables far from the capital. That's the quiet punishment. The loud ones involve whips, and sometimes witnessing them is enough to make you polish your soul out of pure anxiety. Behind you, soft sandals scuff across the floor, measured and deliberate. You don't turn. It's not allowed, but you know the rhythm. That's one of the chamber supervisors, the ones who never speak, but always know who sneezed, who scratched, who hesitated. A moment later, a long brush is gently passed over your shoulder, not as a punishment, just a reminder. Straighten your spine, perfect your hands. The day has already begun for Xerxes, and you're behind. The door that separates this chamber from the king's private quarters remains closed, but the air seems to lean in that direction anyway. Like the rest of the palace, this space breathes around him. The deeper into it you go, the more you sense his presence before you ever see it. The brazier crackles faintly as a eunuch adds more myrrh. Another servant carries in a tray of folded linen, stacked like pressed cakes and warm from the sun-soaked room, where they've been hanging since first light. Each cloth will be used to pat the king's hands, his face, his shoulders, depending on his mood, and then discarded. They will not be washed or reused, not because they're dirty, but because they've touched skin that should never be touched twice. As you finish the final inspection of your silver bowls, you glance up at the tall curtain ahead. It hasn't moved, but you know what lies behind it. Beyond that veil is the king's resting chamber, a space few ever enter, and even fewer return from unchanged. You've heard stories of mosaics on the ceiling, made from crushed garnet, of tables inlaid with ivory from lands no one can name, of a lion cub once gifted by a ruler in India that wandered freely through the corridors before it disappeared one morning, never spoken of again. The only consistent truth in these stories is that whatever happens beyond the curtain, it changes people. A quiet bell sounds just once. That means the king is rising. You gather your bowls, stack them perfectly, and hold them in the crook of your arms, covered with a silk cloth embroidered in red and gold. Your feet barely make a sound as you cross to the waiting chamber, where you'll be granted a brief moment to place your items on the low table beside his washing bench. You do not look up, not at the guards, not at the curtains, not even at the lamp carved in the shape of a bull's head that you love. Secretly, because its face reminds you of your grandfather's oxen, you kneel. The bowls are set, the cloth is removed, and then you vanish again, backward, low to the ground, breath held like a wish. Only after you pass back into the preparation room do you exhale. A supervisor glances at you, not with approval, but with a kind of neutrality you've learned to prize. It means you weren't noticed. It means you did your job. You return to your post and begin to clean the trays again. The bowls will be returned soon, and when they are, they must be spotless, as though they were never used. Somewhere beyond the chamber, the morning chants begin. That means Xerxes has completed his first rites. Soon, he will walk through the hall of 100 columns, and every living soul will be expected to freeze like a fresco until he passes. You will be stationed behind the braziers again, hidden from sight, but close enough to smell the oils on his skin. And this time, the stakes are higher, because sometimes, on rare, unpredictable mornings, the king looks at someone, directly. And today, you've been assigned to stand just 10 paces from his throne. The Hall of 100 Columns isn't just a room. It's a theater, a judgment seat, a trap. You've entered it before, of course, many times now, always in silence and always from the side passage nearest the kitchens. But today you enter with a new assignment. 10 paces from the throne. That's close. Too close. Close enough that the fabric of your robe whispers against the marble, and the guards can see if you're sweating. You've been trusted or tested. You're not sure which yet. The room itself stretches far beyond what seems possible. Each column is carved with beasts and vines, painted in blues and golds that gleam even in the shaded light. Their shadows tangle on the floor like ropes waiting to catch someone's ankles. There are no windows, only high slits that let in light like it's being rationed. Everything here is both grand and controlled, like a lion draped in silk. You know your mark, the exact tile you must stand on. It's been cleaned already, scrubbed twice before dawn by a lower-ranking attendant who won't be allowed inside now that the rune is in use. You step onto it, eyes low, arms folded in front of you just so. The brazier beside you burns with a pale green flame today. That means something, though no one tells you what. You're not supposed to know the codes. Still, you memorize everything. The shade of the incense, the way the heat pools around your ankles, the slight scent of citrus. All of it might mean something. And if it doesn't, it will later. The hall begins to fill, not with sound, but with presence. Generals drift in like ghosts wrapped in leather and bronze, their armor decorated with thin lines of lapis. Priests follow, clicking prayer beads in rhythms that never quite align. Scribes take their places at the walls, scrolls in hand, ink pots strapped to their waists. The queen is not here, but two of the royal sons are, standing near the far side, their expressions unreadable and identical. They have their father's jaw and his stillness. Then come the immortals. The royal guard steps in unison, silent and expressionless. They take their places like pieces on a game board. And that's when the hush deepens, changing from silence into something heavier. Anticipation, maybe, or dread. It folds over the room like a curtain being drawn. A trumpet sounds. Not loud, just one clear note. The great doors at the rear of the hall open, and the king enters. You don't look up. You can't, but you feel it. The change in the air, the way your skin tightens around your bones. He walks slowly, and the sound of his sandals is nothing like yours. Soft, deliberate, commanding. They were made by hand from dyed leather and sewn with gold thread. They are not meant to last more than a few weeks. Every step is a statement. Every worn pair is burned after use. He walks the length of the hall, not hurried, not distracted. You've been told that Xerxes always notices more than he lets on. That he remembers names, faces, failures. That he once had a courtier demoted for arranging flowers with the wrong number of petals. It might be a story. But then again, so much of his reign is a story, retold by those lucky enough to survive it. He stops. You feel him stop. Right there. 10 paces away. You're not sure if it's worse to be looked at or ignored. Either can end badly. You steady your hands and hope that your breathing isn't visible through the folds of your tunic. From the corner of your vision, you glimpse the edge of his robe, white with deep red embroidery. That's the robe of deliberation. Not wrath, not ceremony, not mourning. Just the robe he wears when he's thinking. That's better. Probably. Then he turns. You can't explain how you know, but you do. You feel it, like heat from a fire you can't see. His gaze passes over the chamber, slow and disinterested, or so it seems. His eyes are known to hold a dozen layers. Boredom, calculation, contempt, amusement, but never warmth. Not in the stories, not in your own brief glimpses. They say his mother once told him that a king must never look at people, only through them. Maybe that's what you feel, like someone is seeing the shape of your usefulness, measuring it against the weight of the world he carries. His gaze lands on the high priest first. A nod. Then the general of the southern campaign. A pause. Then your tile, your brazier. You do not move, do not flinch, but your heart claws at your chest, like it wants to flee through your ribs. There is a breath of hesitation. A flicker. You can't be sure, but it feels like he's noticing the arrangement of the coals. Maybe the angle of the flame. Maybe the scent. You prepared it yourself this morning. It should be perfect. It was perfect. But perfection can sometimes look like arrogance to the wrong eyes. And then he moves on. Your knees nearly give way, but you catch yourself. No applause, no condemnation, just movement. He seats himself on the throne, which isn't even the grandest one in the palace. That one is for ceremonies. This is his daily seat, high-backed, narrow, carved with lions that seem to blink if you stare too long. The rest of the hall continues like a performance. Reports are delivered, decisions made, punishments requested and granted. At one point, a scribe reads aloud the names of river inspectors from Bactria. Xerxes doesn't interrupt, just raises one hand when he wants something noted. The scribes adjust their scrolls without missing a beat. The machinery of empire hums beneath a golden silence. You stand still, muscles aching as the morning passes. Occasionally, you shift your weight slightly to keep your feet from going numb, but even that feels risky. The scent of the brazier thickens. The light from above changes angle. And still, you remain unnoticed, which is exactly the goal. Eventually, the audience ends. Xerxes rises and exits the same way he came. The guards close ranks behind him. The generals murmur among themselves, voices low. The hall begins to exhale. Only now do you let your shoulders drop. But the day is far from over. The king has summoned a feast. A formal one, which means gold service, foreign guests, dancers, priests, and careful conversation. And you've just been reassigned to assist with the setup. Not in the kitchens, thank the gods, but behind the veil of the feasting chamber, where trays move in and out like shadows, and every mistake has witnesses with titles. You have an hour to wash, change robes, and find your position among the wall of servants behind the curtain. And this time, you'll be close enough to hear what the nobles are whispering about. You're standing behind a screen of embroidered silk. It smells faintly of crushed roses and something darker, perhaps dried figs or clove oil. The banquet chamber is warm, with candlelight and human tension. Everyone is pretending not to listen while pretending not to be watched. You are supposed to do neither, of course. You are merely a shadow, a moving blur with steady hands. You refill cups, replace trays, adjust cushions. You do not hear anything. You do not feel anything. And under no circumstance do you react, no matter what is said. The room stretches wider than the hall of 100 columns, but feels more intimate, as if the palace itself knows the difference between statecraft and performance. Here, the columns are carved in the shape of cypress trees, their stone branches reaching overhead into a canopy of blue-painted wood, dotted with little flecks of gold to mimic stars. The king is already seated on the raised platform at the far end, draped in a robe embroidered with lions mid-hunt. To his right sits a visiting dignitary from Egypt, fanning himself with a peacock feather even though the room is cool. To his left is General Mardonius, who smiles too often and too widely, like someone constantly planning 3 moves ahead. Servants move along the perimeter, never cutting directly across the center, always in curved routes. You've taken your place behind the curtain, just beside the wine steward's path, close enough to pass goblets, pour diluted wine, and whisk away anything the king dismisses with a flick of his fingers. The golden goblets themselves are works of quiet terror. Each is etched with prayers, floral motifs, or celestial maps, and each weighs more than a small loaf of bread. Dropping one would not merely get you removed. It would require explanation, punishment, ceremony, possibly even purification. You've handled 5 goblets so far, and each one returns to you with a different story. The one handed back by the Egyptian dignitary is still half full. He never drinks deeply. Perhaps he doesn't trust Persian wine, or perhaps he's waiting to see you gets too comfortable first. The cup from the king's brother is always emptied quickly, and always refilled without being requested. He doesn't speak, doesn't smile, but his eyes track everything with the same intensity you imagine hawks reserve for dying animals. Then there's Ainstress's cousin, who fingers her goblet's rim every time someone mentions the Greeks. And they do mention them, constantly, carefully, as if prodding a bruise to see whether it's healed or just hidden. The conversations you hear drift in and out, broken by laughter and strained compliments. One satrap boasts about the number of horses he lost in a flood last spring, as if their drowning proved the strength of his tribute. Another whispers about omens, birds flying backward, a well that produced black water, a priest who spoke in riddles for 3 days before collapsing. You pour wine through it all, nodding at the steward when necessary, pretending that your hands are not trembling ever so slightly. When Xerxes lifts his cup and lets his gaze pass over the room like a shadow pulled by the moon. He hasn't spoken much tonight. His presence is enough. He leans back in his chair, fingers occasionally tapping the armrest, eyes half-lidded but alert. When he does speak, it's usually a single word. Continue, explain, or simply the name of whoever said something interesting or dangerous. You notice that he's on his third goblet now. A rare thing. He's in a mood. Not angry, but not relaxed either. Somewhere in between, where decisions get made and forgotten faces get remembered. The dancers enter next. Not loudly, just in time with the music that's been playing so softly, you'd almost forgotten it was there. Their arms are painted with swirling designs, and bells at their ankles chime faintly with every movement. The room shifts again, tension loosening slightly into something more languid, but not for you. Your attention sharpens. This is when nobles start speaking freely, thinking no one can hear them. But you can. You always do. Someone behind the lattice to your left mutters something about the Canal, how many workers died, how the sea didn't rise the way it was meant to, how even divine kings can be outsmarted by mud. The listener chuckles, then changes the subject. Someone else wonders aloud if Xerxes truly believes in omens, or if he just likes the theater of them. Another suggests, very delicately, that certain generals are favored beyond their competence. And someone, maybe from Babylon or Susa, leans in to ask whether the queen really had a rival buried beneath the garden path last spring. You say nothing. You flinch at nothing. Your face remains as still as the surface of the wine you pour. At one point, a eunuch enters from the far curtain, bearing a tray of figs and pistachios dusted with rose sugar. You pass the tray along, carefully balancing the golden plates, noting who reaches for what. The Egyptian takes 3 figs and no nuts. The general beside him takes the opposite. Xerxes takes nothing. Instead, he watches the tray with vague interest, as though the arrangement might reveal someone's secrets. He does that sometimes, lets other people talk, and decides who lives or dies based on dessert. Then something shifts. A minor noble, young, clearly nervous, starts to speak and is interrupted by one of the king's advisors with a laugh that's a little too sharp. The noble flushes, stumbles, and mumbles something about the tribute delay from Lydia. The room falls quiet. A servant beside you inhales too loudly. You both freeze. The king does not speak, but he stares. Just long enough. Then he stands. The room rises with him, almost as one organism. The musicians stop. The dancers freeze. The laughter dries up in everyone's mouths. He says nothing as he walks out. That, you've learned, is worse than words. The feast doesn't end immediately, but its shape changes. The fun is gone. Now it's just survival. Plates are taken away with greater haste. Goblets are emptied more cautiously. You find yourself helping with the clearing, even though it's not your usual role. Just another body moving things along, blending into the walls. As the last dishes vanish and the guests begin their quiet retreats, you are summoned by the steward with a single raised eyebrow. That's how you learn that you won't be returning to your sleeping mat tonight. Instead, you're to accompany the royal court on its next journey. into the field. Beyond the safety of marble walls, the king is setting out again. Another war camp, another march, another ritual tent in the middle of the wilderness. You wonder if your hands will be steady enough when it's time to pour wine into goblets, swaying from the wind off the Hellespont, and whether the king will remember your face when the firelight flickers just right. The scent of smoke clings to everything now. Your robe, your skin, even the folds behind your ears where you try to rinse but never quite succeed. The war camp breathes a different rhythm than the palace. Gone are the polished stones and painted ceilings. Here, the ground is uneven, always slightly damp, and the air carries the scent of sweat, horse dung, and damp wool. You sleep on woven mats that never seem to dry completely, and your feet are always dirty no matter how often you wash. The fires burn low and long, as if the very act of staying warm needs to be rationed, and everything sounds louder at night, especially the murmurs from the king's tent, where strategies are whispered as if the stars themselves might be spies. You arrived 3 days ago, traveling by barge and cart, with trays strapped to your lap and a folded brazier at your feet. The journey felt like exile, disguised as a promotion. You tried not to read too much into the steward's nod when he assigned you to the traveling court. But you've seen others react that way. People who smile too tightly, who speak in lower tones, who begin to practice walking like they might someday be watched by a king. The war camp sits like a spider at the edge of the Hellespont, legs stretching in every direction, tent clusters for generals, stables for cavalry units, storage sheds for grain and bronze. But at the center lies the heart of it all, the royal tent, stitched in deep crimson and ringed with flickering lanterns. It's not large, but it radiates pressure, the way a storm cloud does before the lightning. Your job is simple, at least in theory. Tend to the king's wine, assist the chamber steward, and stay out of the way unless summoned. But the war camp has its own rules, and the king, away from his stone seat, becomes something else entirely. The tent is warmer than the outside air, but no more comforting. You've stepped inside twice already today, once to set the incense tray, and once to deliver a scroll of battle maps rolled tighter than your stomach. Each time, you kept your eyes low and your back straight. The inner chamber is lined with rugs too fine for mud, but too sacred to be spared. A small brazier glows near the foot of the sleeping couch. The scent of burning myrtle mixes with leather and parchment, and though the space is dim, a gleam of the king's sandals resting beside his stool is unmistakable. He doesn't pace anymore. He used to. Now he sits, or leans, or stares. You can feel it even through the tent fabric, the pulse of his thoughts. Tonight is one of the long nights, the ones where generals enter with news, with proposals, with warnings about supplies and weather. The door flap lifts every few minutes, another silhouette passing through the lamplight like a ghost. No one lingers long. Most emerge wordless, shoulders squared or sagging, depending on what was said. Then thunder rolls. Not real thunder, not yet. Just the clatter of voices rising from the direction of the planning pavilion. A disagreement over the western flank, maybe, or an argument about reinforcements that haven't yet arrived. You've learned to listen for patterns. When 3 voices rise and one cuts through sharply, that's Margonius, taking control again. When no one speaks for several minutes, and then someone storms off with heavy steps, that's the Faban commander, who always wants more horses than he's allowed. You are not supposed to know these things, but you do. The king emerges from his inner chamber sometime past midnight. You don't see him come out. One moment, he is inside. The next, he is standing near the brazier, one hand resting lightly on the neck of a bronze oil jug. He doesn't speak. He watches. A steward notices and pours wine into the goblet waiting on the low table. You can tell, even from 10 paces away, that it's not the goblet the king wanted. You feel it in the air, the tightening, the shift. The steward freezes. The king does not shout. He simply gestures. A different goblet is brought. No apology is given. The wine is poured again, this time correctly. Later, after the others have left, you're summoned inside. No words. Just a hand from one of the guards, gesturing you forward. You carry the cloths for wiping the drinking vessels and a small bronze funnel for decanting the resin-scented wine. Inside, the king is seated on a thick cushion, legs crossed, fingers wrapped around his knee. He watches you as you enter, not with suspicion, not even with curiosity, but with the kind of awareness a lion might have for a beetle crawling nearby. He could crush you, but why bother? You set the items down slowly, deliberately. You bow. And then, just as you begin to retreat, he speaks. What was the cloud like today? The question is so unexpected, you nearly stumble. You aren't sure you heard correctly, or if he's even speaking to you. But you nod, unsure if a reply is expected. The king doesn't press. He just turns away, staring at the side of the tent where shadows flicker from the brazier's light. Later, you realize there was only one cloud in the sky today, a long, thin streak over the sea. Everyone noticed it. No one mentioned it. When you leave the tent, your fingers are trembling, not from fear, not entirely, but from the sense that something shifted, that a question was asked for reasons beyond your grasp. Outside, the wind has picked up. The sea murmurs in the distance, and the smell of coming rain clings to the edge of every gust. You help secure the guy lines of the tent, adjusting the canvas so it doesn't flap too loudly. The thunder returns, this time real, rolling low and deep from the west. A storm is coming. You don't sleep much that night, not because of fear, but because of possibility. And in the morning, when the camp stirs and the soldiers grumble and the clouds finally break open, you're already awake, preparing the goblets again, polishing them with the same care you would give to a sacred object. Because you've just been told that you'll accompany the king on his next inspection, one that takes him and you straight into the field lines where battle may break. And mistakes, out there, echo much louder than in marble halls. The field lines are muddy, uneven, and strangely quiet, even with an army encamped around you. You've followed the king into what they call the second circle, close enough to hear the officers argue, far enough to still be considered expendable. It's not where anyone wants to be, but you've learned that wanting doesn't mean much in Xerxes' orbit. If you're told to be somewhere, you go. If you're not told, you stay perfectly still and pray someone remembers to summon you before you become part of the scenery. You carry the wine jug again today. Not the king's, not this time. His cupbearer guards that duty like a lion. But you serve the inner circle of commanders, men with sunburned cheeks and eyes like cracked marble. Your hands are steady, your mouth closed, your steps exact. You've rehearsed the posture. You know the rhythm. You are trying, very hard, not to be noticed. That almost works. It happens during the second inspection. The king is walking past the cavalry pens, where horses stamp and whinny in the shifting mud. The air smells of leather and wet wood. You're behind the steward's cart, polishing the rim of a dish when the accident occurs. A young stable hand, 15, maybe 16, trips while leading one of the new horses. The animal jolts, panics, and collides with the outer edge of the king's procession. A brazier topples, sparks fly, a robe is singed. No one is hurt, not truly. But that's not the point. There is silence, the kind that makes birds stop mid-song. The king doesn't raise his voice. He simply turns, gestures once, and walks away. That's all it takes. The guard sees the stable hand. The boy's face is pale with terror. You see his lips move, but you don't hear the words. Maybe he's apologizing. Maybe he's begging. Maybe he's reciting prayers he learned as a child. The punishment is swift. A public flogging, 20 lashes. The kind meant to humiliate more than harm. Still, by the 10th strike, he's sobbing. By the 15th, he's quiet. By the 20th, he's barely upright. You think of offering water. You almost step forward. Then you remember the goblet in your hand, the polished rim, the line of your spine. You stay exactly where you are. Later that evening, something strange happens. The king visits the stables again, alone except for one attendant. He walks slowly past the pens, stops at the edge of the training field, and asks to see the horse that panicked. No anger, no theatrics, just a request. The animal is brought forward. It's calm now, docile. The king strokes its mane, then speaks quietly with the handler. Then he leaves. The next morning, the stable hand reappears. Bruised, yes. Quiet, absolutely. But alive. Reassigned to tent maintenance. Safer, quieter work. You hear one of the older servants whisper that it was the Queen Mother's doing. Others say the king was moved by the boy's posture during punishment, that he respects people who endure pain without collapsing. No one knows the truth, but the boy still walks. And that's rare enough to start a rumor. The return march begins shortly after. No grand announcements, no victory parades. Just the slow, deliberate movement of the royal column back towards safer ground. The campaign is not over, not officially, but something has shifted. The king no longer listens to battlefield reports with the same hunger. His eyes drift more often. He speaks less. His robe changes color, not black, not mourning, but darker, as if reflecting a mood he refuses to name. You walk behind the procession, helping to load and unload provisions, watching the shifting lines of soldiers as they vanish into the dust one by one. The terrain grows dry again, less green, more cracked. Somewhere behind you, thunder rolls. This time, no one flinches. It's on the third night of the return that you find yourself summoned again, not by name, but by gesture. A steward points, a guard waves, and suddenly you're standing in the royal tent once more, setting out the wine goblets as if nothing has changed, except everything has. The tension feels quieter now, but deeper, like roots growing beneath a stone. You pour, you kneel, you retreat. No words are exchanged. But as you step outside, your mind drifts, not forward, but backward, to the very beginning, to the throne you've only glimpsed from a distance, to the man who inherited an empire, carved by war and ceremony. You've seen him at feast and on campaign. But who was he before the robe, before the sandals, before the first order ever left his lips? And with that thought lingering just behind your eyes, you begin to wonder what it must have been like not to serve him, but to be him. Before he was the king who whipped the sea and silenced a banquet hall with a glance, Xerxes was just a prince, a second son born into a palace too large to navigate without getting lost, and a shadow far too long to ever truly escape. You can imagine him then, years before you ever arrived in service, trailing behind his older brother Artabazans in the courtyards of Persepolis, mimicking the way the elder boy held a scroll or the way he paused before speaking, as if already practicing the posture of a crown he did not yet know would be his. That crown, woven metaphorically of iron and gold, belonged to Darius the Great, and it hung heavy even on the son he hadn't chosen first. You hear whispers of those years in the palace kitchens, where old servants talk freely when they think no one important is listening. They say Xerxes was a quiet boy, too serious for games, who could recite royal genealogies before he could lift a ceremonial sword. He was the kind of child who made adults nervous, not because he misbehaved, but because he watched too closely. One cook claimed she caught him once staring at a bowl of pomegranate seeds as if calculating the geometry of their placement. Another said he could repeat any conversation he overheard, even hours later, with chilling precision. He wasn't cruel, not then, but he was deliberate. And people are always wary of children who are more observant than playful. He spent most of his early years under the guidance of Atossa, his mother, who happened to be the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire himself. She was royalty squared, and unlike many royal women of her time, she didn't live behind veils and curtains. She met with priests. She advised generals. She corrected court scribes when they made errors in titles or names. Atossa was a storm in fine linen, and everyone knew she was the one steering her son's future long before Darius admitted it out loud. The succession itself wasn't straightforward. Darius had many sons. Artabazanes, the eldest, was born before Darius became king and had already begun gathering supporters. He was well-liked, if not especially brilliant, an affable sort who smiled easily and avoided confrontation. But he didn't have Atossa behind him. Xerxes did. And so, a subtle campaign began. Whispers of divine dreams. Letters sent to satraps wrapped in riddles. Temple petitions that just happened to be signed in Xerxes' favor. Whether Darius was truly convinced by a message from the gods, or simply outmaneuvered by his wife, remains one of history's soft mysteries. But in the end, it was Xerxes whom Darius named as his successor. You imagine the moment it became real to him. Not the coronation, not yet, but that first day when guards began saluting with a different kind of stiffness. When people bowed a fraction deeper. When his sandals echoed louder in the halls, because no one dared speak over the sound. Maybe it happened the day he entered the royal archive and found a new set of scrolls with his name scrawled at the top. Xerxes, Crown Prince of Persia. Or maybe it came one night when he was studying the battle logs of Cyrus and paused at a page too stained with wine to read properly, and thought, that will be me soon. The empire he stood to inherit wasn't a single crown. It was more like a net, stretched taut over deserts and rivers and mountains, held in place by fear, gold, and logistical nightmares. From the wheat fields of Egypt to the horse plains of Bactria, everything fed into the palace like blood through veins. Darius had built that network, brilliantly, obsessively. He had issued standardized weights and measures, constructed roads so efficient that messages could fly faster than birds, organized tax codes detailed enough to make your head spin. He ruled with a pen as sharp as any blade, and for 2 decades it worked. But by the time Xerxes was declared heir, cracks had begun to form. Darius' final years were not peaceful. Revolts brewed in Egypt. Discontent whispered through Babylon. Even within the palace, factions bloomed like mold under marble. Advisors, generals, priests, each with their own theories, preferences, and quiet threats. You've heard stories of Darius growing increasingly irritable, pacing at night, demanding audience with priests who arrived trembling and left pale. Some say he dreamed of shadows, others that he spoke to statues. One court servant swore he saw the king pour wine onto the floor and demand the earth return it, just to test the gods. Xerxes, meanwhile, said little and watched much. He didn't challenge his father's authority. That would have been fatal, but he also didn't wait passively. He began forging relationships. He spent hours with temple officials, learning which rituals pleased which deities and which priests enjoyed which gifts. He memorized his father's court rhythms, the times of day when Darius was generous, and the times when he would fly into rages over a smudged scroll or misplaced goblet. He studied the palace treasury, reviewed tribute manifests, and asked careful questions that suggested curiosity, not ambition. But the scribes remember. They always do. Then, slowly, people started shifting their posture. Courtiers who once spent hours flattering Artabazanes began accidentally dropping scrolls near Xerxes. Gifts meant for Darius mysteriously bore seals with the crown prince's insignia. The tide had turned. By the time Darius officially named Xerxes heir, half the court was already acting as if the decision had been made years ago. And then the old king began to fail. No one speaks loudly about Darius' death. It wasn't dramatic. No glorious last battle. No poison or palace goo. He simply faded, grew thinner, slept more, ate less. The priests prescribed incense and prayer. The physicians offered dried figs and bitter root mixtures. None of it worked. He spent his last weeks in a shadowed chamber at Susa, where only the most trusted advisors and attendants were allowed to enter. Some say Xerxes was there every day. Others say he stayed away to avoid the image of power withering before his eyes. When the king finally died, the palace did not erupt in mourning. It held its breath. The passing of Darius wasn't just a personal loss. It was a political earthquake. Power in Persia wasn't inherited with tears and embraces. It was seized with stillness and ritual. Xerxes stepped into that void like a man already wearing the robe. The coronation took days, chants, sacrifices, processions, but those were formalities. The true transfer of power had already happened, in whispers and glances, months before. You picture him standing alone in the high courtyard, the morning after Darius was entombed. The city below barely awake, the guards distant, the sky heavy with early heat. He's not a boy anymore, not a prince, just a man with an empire on his shoulders. Maybe he feels nothing. Maybe he feels everything. Maybe he's already thinking about the Greeks. Because the Greeks, those sharp-tongued, sea-loving rebels, had defied his father at Marathon, and Xerxes was now king. That meant Marathon wasn't history. It was unfinished business. And for a ruler raised on legacies, nothing was more dangerous than an insult left unpunished. There's a saying whispered among the older eunuchs in the Persepolis courts, when they're sure no one important is listening. Only a fool sits on a lion's throne without asking the lion what made it roar. The lion, in that saying, is Darius. And the fool, well, they don't say his name out loud, but you get the sense they mean Xerxes. Or at least, the version of him that emerged after the coronation fires died down, and the marble halls echoed with footsteps that were no longer his father's. You can imagine the way it began. The new king pacing alone through the inner chambers of Persepolis, barefoot on stone floors chilled by dawn air, tracing his hand along carved lotus petals on a column he'd known since childhood. Except now it belonged to him. All of it did. Not just the halls and the gardens and the roads that vanished into mountains, but the cities he'd never seen, the vassals he'd never met, and the people who'd never spoken his name but would now be required to worship it. One of his first decisions wasn't about war or tribute or governors. It was about marble. He ordered a new audience hall to be built. Not a small one, not even a practical one, but a monumental one, large enough to hold the full tribute delegations from every corner of the empire at once. It would be called the Hall of 100 Columns, though some say it had even more. It would be built not just of stone, but of ambition and of rivalry. It had to outshine anything his father left behind. It had to be timeless. You were a child when construction began, years before you stepped foot into the palace as a servant. But the city still talks about the day the plans were unveiled. Men wept. Women sang blessings. Brickmakers were handed silk robes in thanks. And at the very heart of it all stood Xerxes, arms folded, eyes locked on the horizon, as if already imagining where the light would fall on the lion carvings at sunset. He expanded other buildings, too, towers, pavilions. The great Apadana, with its sweeping staircases covered in reliefs of Medes, Elamites, Lydians, Babylonians, all bringing gifts to the king. The architecture was meant to awe, and it did. Columns rose like petrified trees, painted in cobalt and saffron, lined with gold. The walls gleamed. The floors clicked under heel. It was said that the ceiling beams in one chamber were brought whole from distant forests and took 100 men to carry each one. But with each addition, each inscription etched in multiple languages, each proclamation declaring the strength and unity of the empire. There was another voice, softer, more personal, that never stopped speaking. Atossa. You hear her name whispered in the servant halls, always with a curious mix of reverence and discomfort. She's old now, but she still carries power. They say her glance can still make a satrap apologize, that her letters are opened before any general's report. But when Xerxes was still young, she was the one who shaped his fire and warned him not to let it consume the walls around him. She visited the construction sites in person, veiled but unmistakable, stepping lightly across scaffolding with a walking stick carved through olive wood. She would speak only a few words to the foreman, ask after materials, offer praise. But to Xerxes, she spoke plainly. Do not build so high that you forget what cracked the last pillar, she told him once, or the name of the mason who carved your name beside your father's. It was said without anger, but not without weight, because Atossa remembered the last years of Darius' reign, the whispers, the dissent, the failed Egyptian revolt, the endless need for more taxes, more soldiers, more compliance. She had seen what too much ambition without balance could do, and she had no interest in watching it happen again, especially not through the hands of her own son. But Xerxes was no longer a boy sitting at her knee. He was a ruler, a man with silks too heavy for his own frame, with servants who never met his eyes, and advisors who answered questions before he asked them. He listened to Atossa, yes, but not always. Not when it came to legacy, and not when it came to vengeance, because that is where her voice met its limit, Marathon. Xerxes was not at the Battle of Marathon, but its failure hung over him like the scent of smoke in a forgotten room. His father had tried to punish the Athenians for their defiance, sent troops, ships, men, and watched them lose. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough to leave a mark. Enough for Greek storytellers to brag. Enough for Darius to stew over the shame until his final days. Enough for Xerxes to inherit not just a crown, but a grudge. And that was something even Atossa couldn't sway. She warned him, gently at first. Greece is a distant fire. Let it burn itself out, she would say. Later, when she sensed his resolve harden, you have the world already. Why chase pebbles on the shore? But Xerxes didn't see pebbles. He saw insult. He saw rebellion wrapped in marble togas. And he knew what stories could do to a king's image, how quickly glory could curdle into mockery. Athens had humiliated Persia once, and he would make sure it never happened again. The preparations began slowly, just troop movements at first, then new alliances forged in Anatolia, new ships commissioned in Sidon and Tyre. The coastal satrapies began to buzz with activity. Gold flowed more freely from the treasury, and incense from Babylon arrived by the crate. But the crown prince no longer looked east toward India. His gaze was west, toward the Aegean, toward revenge. You sometimes wonder if Atossa ever regretted her son's rise. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't. Not in those early years, but because power had changed him. Or maybe revealed something that was always there. A hunger not just to rule, but to be remembered. To match the size of the empire with the shape of his name in history. And history, as you've learned, is an impatient dinner guest. It demands more wine, louder toasts, bigger stories, and eventually, someone to blame when the evening ends badly. You imagine Atossa in her private garden, long after sunset, holding a scroll and frowning at its contents. Perhaps it's a report of troops drilling in Sardis, or a temple renovation where offerings are now made to Xerxes by name. Or maybe it's nothing, just a list of gifts. And still, she frowns, because she knows where the story is going. She knows that the son she shaped is no longer building palaces out of marble. He's building bridges over water, the kind no one dares cross twice. And soon, those bridges will lead him into the fire his mother warned him about. The decision to invade Greece was not a fiery declaration shouted from atop a staircase, or a dramatic unveiling to a breathless court. It was quiet, as these things often are. A single finger placed on a map, tracing the wrinkled edge of Ionia, and resting for a moment at the coast near Marathon. Xerxes didn't speak. He didn't need to. The meaning was clear. This was not a new war. It was the continuation of an old one. A war of memory, of legacy, and of something even sharper, insult. Greece was a bruise beneath the empire's skin, and Xerxes intended to press down until it turned purple or vanished altogether. You were not in the room, of course. That chamber belonged to generals and viziers, men who sat over long scrolls and spoke in clipped, careful tones. But you felt the shift almost immediately. Something changed in the palace that day. The way messengers hurried, the way scribes began sharpening new styluses before old ones were worn out. The kitchens cooked larger batches, and the goldsmiths were instructed to design medals before a single battle had begun. It wasn't victory they were preparing for. It was narrative. Xerxes' decision was not born solely from ambition. It grew from the shadow of his father's frustration. Darius had launched a campaign to punish Athens after their interference in Ionia, and his forces had been driven back at Marathon in a defeat that stung far more than he ever admitted. Xerxes inherited more than his father's throne. He inherited that wound. The stories from Marathon had spread, told in the taverns and temples of the Greek world. Tales of hoplite courage, of divine favor, of a tiny democracy standing against a tidal wave of empire. True or not, it didn't matter. Stories shape power. Xerxes understood this all too well. He didn't want to conquer Athens just to punish it. He wanted to erase the memory of its victory, to pull the tale from the mouths of poets and replace it with silence. What followed was no ordinary military preparation. The scale of mobilization defied belief. You began to see it in your own tasks. At first, you were sent to carry sealed documents from the temple scribes to the logistics stewards, a simple enough assignment. But those scrolls grew heavier by the week. Requisitions for rations written in 6 languages. Troop tallies that counted not hundreds, but tens of thousands. Inventories of grain, of wine, of linen tunics, of bridles and arrowheads, of gilded banners and ceremonial plinths. Everything doubled, then tripled, and still it wasn't enough. The army being assembled was not a force, it was a phenomenon. Rivers were diverted to support it. Roads were widened. Entire towns were transformed into supply depots overnight. The palace, once humming with the idle rituals of court life, began to throb with purpose. The court astrologers rarely left their towers. The treasurers stopped attending festivals. The air in Persepolis tasted of bronze and wet ink. Even the incense smelled sharper, more medicinal, as if the empire itself had caught fever. The empire's subject peoples were called upon, each sending troops, ships, or tribute. From the Phoenicians came warships with black-painted hulls and sailors who smelled of salt and pitch. From Babylon came siege engineers and offerings to the gods of battle. From Egypt, charioteers and scribes bearing treaties older than most cities in the West. The scale was impossible to comprehend. Some claimed the army would reach 1 million men. Others scoffed, but even the skeptics spoke in awe. No force like this had marched in living memory, not for conquest, but for vengeance. Yet amid the movement, you noticed something else. Not resistance exactly, but unease. Older courtiers began walking slower, speaking in more cautious tones. Satraps who once boasted of their loyalty started requesting reassignment to provinces farther from the west. Even Atossa, the queen mother, began to pray more frequently, slipping into the temple at Ars, emerging with her veil damp from tears or incense or both. Rumors swirled that she had warned her son not to pursue this path, that she had reminded him the empire was already vast, already groaning under its own weight. But Xerxes would not be deterred. Not now. Not when the ghost of his father's failure still haunted the Apadana steps. You weren't close enough to hear her words, but you didn't need to. The evidence was everywhere. At night, scribes worked by torchlight, copying names onto supply manifests, knowing that most of those names would vanish in the mud along the way. Carpenters were pulled from royal projects to fashion collapsible bridges. Scribes began training second and third apprentices, preparing for losses even in their own ranks. The palace itself began to feel like a body preparing for surgery, cleansed, ordered, sealed, and quiet. Eventually, the king departed. You weren't part of the led procession. That honor fell to the generals, the cupbearers, and the favored priests. But you followed days later, part of the supporting wave of court officials, ritual attendants, and record keepers who ensured the empire's customs would be maintained even on the march. Your duties became stranger. One day, you arranged storage for 20 barrels of myrrh to be burned along the coast of Thrace. Another, you were tasked with copying a scroll listing the precise names of all generals allowed to sit near the king's table in camp. Not dine, sit near. The proximity itself was ritual. Nothing about this campaign was unmeasured. As the march continued north, stories filtered back from the front. That Xerxes had constructed pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, and that a storm had destroyed them. That he had ordered the sea whipped, and that priests had hurled curses into the waves. Some in your caravan laughed when they heard it. Others said nothing. You didn't laugh. You remembered the silence in the king's eyes. Whether the tale was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was what it represented. A man so determined to rule the narrative that even the sea was expected to submit. Meanwhile, Persepolis stood eerily still behind you. The palace fires still burned. The columns still gleamed in the sun. But it felt hollow, as if the breath had left the lungs of the city. The court had become a shadow stretching westward, dragging behind it all the weight of ceremony, pride, and pressure. You knew, as you watched soldiers march by in columns, so long they vanished into the horizon, that this was not merely a war of men. It was a war of images. Xerxes was not just marching to conquer land. He was marching to reshape memory. On the eve of the crossing into Europe, your caravan made camp near the sea. You stood near the supply tent, watching the sky darken to ash, and wondered how much the king had changed since he left the palace. You wondered whether he still consulted his mother, whether he still sat in silence before battle, the way some claimed his father had done, whether he ever doubted himself, or if the machinery he'd built was now too large to stop, even if he wanted to. Somewhere nearby, a group of younger scribes were debating the coming campaign. One quoted a priest who had claimed the gods favored the Persians. Another recited a Greek proverb he had overheard from a captured sailor. The taller the tree, the harder it falls. The others laughed, but not you, because you understood something they didn't. Xerxes wasn't reaching toward glory. He was running from a shadow, and he would chase that shadow across land and sea until he either outran it or became it. The first thing you notice about Thermopylae is the way the land seems to push back. It is not a welcoming place. The mountains rise steep and close, leaning over the narrow road, as if conspiring with the sea to choke anything that dares pass between them. The air is heavy with salt and pine resin, and though the sun shines hot during the day, the shadows along the cliffs are strangely cold, even in late summer. This is no grand plain, no open valley for armies to maneuver. It is a bottleneck, one long, coiled throat with only one way in and one way out. It is, in every way that matters, a trap. You arrive just ahead of the main assault, attached to a logistics team sent to support the king's forward pavilion. By now, a campaign has become your routine. You know how to unpack the scroll chests in sequence, how to set the ceremonial salt stones at the entrance of the royal tent, and how to remain invisible while performing 100 small acts of preparation. But something about this place unnerves you. Maybe it's the silence. The soldiers don't speak much here. Even the officers keep their voices low. You sense the weight of hesitation clinging to everything. The pause before the strike, the breath before the scream. The enemy, you are told, is not large. A few thousand men at most, defending this narrow pass. Primarily Spartans, along with contingents from smaller Greek states, Phocians, Thebans, some from Thespia. You've heard of the Spartans before. Everyone has. They fight like they've already made peace with dying. They're the kind of men who would rather bleed in a narrow canyon than bow in a golden hall. It sounds like madness to you, but the generals don't laugh when they speak of them. They speak with tight jaws and lowered eyes. The first assault begins at dawn. You don't see it directly. Your station is within the second perimeter, just outside the royal command tent, but you feel the ripples of urgency as they pass through the camp. Runners come and go in pairs. Horses return, lathered with sweat. The scribes begin preparing blank scrolls without waiting for dictation. You are tasked with preparing the ceremonial goblets for potential victory rites, though no one says when those will be needed. A signal flag is raised and lowered and raised again. No horns are sounded. No cheers echo across the valley. By midday, it's clear the Greeks have not fallen. The second day is worse. A wave of Medes is sent into the pass, and the survivors return in silence, their armor streaked with dust and blood. You overhear an officer say, the Spartans fight in tight formations, shield to shield, spears flashing like fish scales in sunlight. The terrain favors them. The cliffs prevent flanking. The sea blocks any retreat. And yet they do not bend. Each assault becomes more desperate than the last. More archers are deployed. Slings are brought forward. Still, the line holds. You begin to notice something unusual in the way Xerxes moves through the camp. His steps are slower now, more deliberate. He consults fewer advisors. He spends longer hours in the strategy tent, not issuing commands, but staring at maps with a strange kind of stillness. When messengers bring updates, he doesn't react, not with anger, not with satisfaction. Just a nod, sometimes barely perceptible, before waving them away. The royal tent grows quieter each night. The brazier is no longer kept burning past midnight. The music, once a nightly presence, has ceased altogether. On the third morning, something changes. You're woken early by a courier demanding ink and paper. He says the king requires a new proclamation drawn up immediately. You carry the scrolls yourself to the central camp and find the scribe who will inscribe the message. While waiting, you hear the words passed between officers. A Greek trader has revealed a hidden path through the mountains. A goat trail, narrow and winding, but passable. The immortals, Xerxes' elite guard, have already begun to move. The Spartans will be surrounded by dusk. The mood in camp should be celebratory, but it isn't. The men are tense. A few joke half-heartedly, but their laughter is brittle. You sense it in your bones. This isn't victory. This is inevitability, and it tastes like iron. The kind of triumph that comes too late to be clean. You return to your post just in time to see a rider gallop in from the north, his tunic torn, face streaked with dirt. He dismounts with a groan and hands a blood-smeared tablet to a waiting captain. The captain reads, closes his eyes, and gives a single nod. It's done. The pass has been taken. Later that night, the royal court observes a private ritual. You are summoned to assist with the ceremonial line. There is no feast, no music, no gold-draped procession. Just a brazier burning low, the scent of myrrh and ash in the air, and a single golden cup placed before the king. You pour carefully, not meeting his eyes. He doesn't speak, doesn't toast. He simply lifts the cup, drinks once, and places it down without a word. That should have been the moment of celebration. Instead, it feels like mourning. Over the next 2 days, the army begins to move again, passing through the captured pass and into the lands beyond. The terrain changes slowly, mountains giving way to hills, hills to low plains. Villages are passed, some abandoned, some emptied in advance, their gates open and food stores left behind in uneasy tribute. The scribes record each surrender. A king signs each decree of pardon. But you notice that none of the commanders speak of Thermopylae anymore. They avoid the name entirely, referring to it only as the pass or the gateway, as if saying the word aloud might summon something unwelcome. You find yourself dreaming about the battlefield. You've never seen it directly, only passed near it, but still the images come, shields piled high, a narrow wall of spears, blood trickling through gravel. In the dream, the cliffs lean in further, becoming faces. Watching, waiting. One evening, you assist in inventorying the spoils taken from the fallen. Among the items are several Greek cloaks, red and coarse, still stiff with salt and blood. One of the younger servants jokes that he might take one as a souvenir. No one laughs. The cloak is burned that night, without ceremony. As the campaign moves southward, toward Athens, there is no doubt about the momentum. The Greeks retreat. Their allies fracture. The road to the city lies open. Yet the feeling in the camp is not of triumph. It's something closer to caution, or perhaps shame. Thermopylae was meant to be a demonstration, a moment that would prove Persia's power. Instead, it has become a question mark, an ugly victory, a name that whispers in the silence between conversations. You hear that Xerxes ordered a monument erected over the battlefield, not a grand one, just a stone stele, carved in 3 languages, recording the conquest of the pass. But the wording, you're told, is unusually subdued. No mention of glory, no declaration of divine favor. Just facts, distance, stone. One night, as you sit folding parchment under the moonlight, you hear a voice beside you, an older steward who has served in campaigns since Darius' time. He says nothing for a long moment, then quietly murmurs, "It took 3 days to defeat a few hundred men." He does not elaborate. He does not need to. You do not reply, because deep down, you understand what he means. The pass may be behind you now, but it is not forgotten. Thermopylae did not halt the army, but it left a mark on the king, on the soldiers, on the story that will eventually be told. A mark not of failure, but of resistance. Not a wall, but a wound. And the worst part of all is knowing that even as the king pushes forward, past the mountains and toward the heart of Greece, he carries that wound with him. Not visible, not named, but present all the same, like a weight in the back of the throat. And Athens, bright, stubborn, fragile Athens, is still ahead. The sea near Salamis glitters like oil under the noonday sun, thick with heat and tension. From the cliffs above, you can see both fleets, the Persian navy vast and gleaming, its ships drawn up in formation like rows of spearheads, and the Greek vessels farther in, smaller, darker, scattered like pebbles in the surf. You stand beside a supply officer, tasked with charting provisions for the fleet, watching the shimmering water and the thin line of smoke already beginning to rise from distant fires. It is not a battlefield yet, not officially, but it will be. Everyone knows it. You can feel it in the stillness, in the way the air holds its breath. The king has set up his command post on a rocky rise overlooking the strait. His pavilion is modest by royal standards. No draped silks or ivory statues, just a firm tent pegged down against the Aegean winds. A small brazier, and a wide table covered in sea charts, wind readings, and messenger scrolls. You are stationed nearby, helping tend to the royal scribes and ensuring the ritual goblets are kept clean, though you suspect none will be used tonight. There is no feast to prepare for, no tribute expected. The only offering here will be made in blood and fire, and it will be the sea that receives it. Tensions within the Persian ranks are rising. Some commanders have begun to argue openly. questioning the plan to press the fleet into the narrow straits. The Greeks are boxed in, they say, but that may be more of a trap than an advantage. Themistocles, the Athenian commander, has sent messages, mocking, misleading, calculated to provoke. One scroll claims he's willing to switch sides. Another implies the Greeks are preparing to flee. It's all games, all lies. The trick everyone knows is that Themistocles wants the Persians to attack now, when the tides are wrong and the wind favors the defenders. And still, Xerxes chooses to proceed. You have seen him watching the sea for hours at a time, unmoving. He doesn't speak, doesn't ask questions. It's as though he's willing himself to see past the glittering surface into the result he demands. To him, perhaps, the battle is already over. The outcome predetermined. Greece crushed beneath the weight of empire. The Asians soaked in the proof of Persian supremacy. The order is given late in the afternoon. The fleet begins to move, oars cutting the sea like 1,000 synchronized blades. The ships glide toward the strait with terrifying precision. You climb partway up the hill to where the king's chair has been placed, a tall, carved seat that stands alone against the sky. You aren't close enough to hear his words, but you see his posture as he watches, arms resting on the lion-headed ends of the chair, eyes fixed on the narrowing water. Behind him, a few scribes take notes. Further back, guards remain still as statues. The only sound is the wind, flapping the edge of the royal banner and the distant slap of wood on water. Then the battle begins. At first, it's only movement. Ships turning, sails shifting, archers readying. And the noise arrives like a storm. Crashing wood, shouting voices, horn blasts. The air cracks with the sound of hulls splitting against rams, followed by the sharp, awful percussion of fire-catching pitch. The Persians press in, confident in their numbers, but the narrowness of the strait works against them. The Greek ships dart between them like wolves among oxen, nimble and ruthless. One after another, larger vessels collide, unable to maneuver. Arrows fall like rain. The sea begins to churn red. From the hillside, it looks less like a battle than a boiling. Ships twist and sink. Flames lick the sides of triremes. You hear the king bark something to one of his aides, who dashes down the slope toward a cluster of commanders. A new order, maybe, or a rebuke, or just a demand to explain the unexplainable. But the tide has turned. You can see it clearly, even from this distance. The Persian fleet is being crushed, slowly, messily, humiliatingly, by a force a fraction of its size. The sun begins to set as the worst of it unfolds. The water reflects the flames in sickening beauty. Columns of black smoke rise like temple incense, drifting inland. The smell is thick, burnt wood, oil, salt, and the bitter tongue of blood. You keep your sleeve pressed to your face, eyes watering. Some servants nearby begin whispering prayers under their breath. One of the scribes quietly rolls up his scroll, as if recording the loss would somehow make it worse. Xerxes does not rise. He does not speak. He simply watches as the fleet, his fleet, the pride of the empire, breaks apart piece by piece. Even when a nearby officer falls to one knee and begs to withdraw the ships, Xerxes says nothing. He lifts one hand slightly, palm downward. Not a dismissal, not exactly. More like a silence being enforced by will alone. The battle ends in darkness. Fires burn through the night. The survivors limp back to shore in scorched vessels, their eyes vacant, their armor half melted to their skin. You help distribute water to the returning soldiers, though most do not drink. They just sit, staring at the ground or the sky, as if looking in either direction might change what has already happened. One man vomits onto his sandals. Another curls up beneath a broken tent pole and doesn't move for hours. The next morning, the sea is calm again, almost cruelly so. Bodies still float in the shallows. wreckage bobs in gentle waves. The Persians lost ships by the hundreds. The Greeks lost only a handful. The difference is obscene. The king holds no council. He meets with no generals. He issues no formal proclamation. He simply orders the army to begin marching inland once more, and the court obeys. You are instructed to repack the royal archives and prepare for departure. No one mentions Athens. No one mentions Salamis. The fire is over, but the smoke lingers, caught in your clothes, your skin, your memory. As you walk beside the caravan, following the slow line of pack animals and carts, bearing shattered shields and half-used arrows, you look back at the water once more. The strait looks so small from this distance, so harmless. It seems absurd that so much pride and planning could be swallowed by something so narrow. But you understand now that it was never just about ships or tactics. It was about control. And in that moment, on that day, the king lost it. Not all of it, not his crown, not his army, but something intangible and vital, something that cannot be recovered by decree or force. A fracture in the myth, a crack in the mirror he held up to the world. And though his soldiers will continue to march, and his banners will continue to wave, the man who rides at the head of the procession is not quite the same as the one who came before. He still commands, but the world has begun to doubt. You return to Persia not in triumph, but in silence. There are no drums, no celebratory processions, no golden ribbons stretched across city gates. The great king's army moves like a long shadow through the empire's veins, silent and spent, its banners limp and its victories uncertain. You ride in one of the final caravans, following the trail of the court as it winds through the Zagros Mountains and down into the lowlands of Susa. The horses are thinner now. The carts carry more wounded than gold. The servants speak more softly. Everyone is tired, not just in the body, but in the soul. Xerxes doesn't lead from the front. He rides quietly at the center of the procession, surrounded by guards who say little and offer less. You see him only once on the return journey, seated beneath a striped canopy while the army crosses a shallow river. His face is expressionless, his fingers tapping slowly against the carved handle of a fan that no one seems brave enough to offer him. His robe is the deep rust red of ceremony, but it looks like it hasn't been washed since the loss at Salamis. He no longer performs the role of the divine king. He no longer seems interested in theater. He simply observes and continues. Back in Susa, the palace prepares for his return with quiet efficiency. The marble floors are polished. The fountains run again. The eunuchs light incense at the doorways. But no one lines the roads to greet him. There are no flowers thrown from balconies, no choirs of children, no satraps elbowing each other for proximity to the throne. The applause that once met his footsteps now falls to memory. The throne awaits him, but it does not sing. You are reassigned to the palace temple, where the high priest is preparing new rites to cleanse the court of wartime corruption. It is customary after a campaign, regardless of outcome. But this time, it feels heavier. The purification rituals are longer. The chants are lower. The sacrificial fires burn hotter, as if trying to cauterize something deeper than physical impurity. You help fetch scrolls from the archives, recording the rituals in 3 languages, binding them in leather, and placing them in a cedar chest that smells faintly of smoke. The priests do not smile as they work. In the weeks that follow, the king withdraws almost completely from public view. He holds only the most necessary audiences, and those who are admitted to his presence emerge pale and subdued. Rumors begin to swirl, quiet at first, then louder, that he has stopped sleeping, that he has begun trusting omens over reports, that he no longer speaks with Atossa. Some say he prays more. Others say he prays less. You don't know which to believe. What you do know is that he walks the palace corridors late at night, barefoot, in robes that whisper more than they rustle. You witness one of these walks once, entirely by accident. You are restocking an incense basin near the queen's chamber when he passes by, alone except for one guard. His eyes flick briefly toward you, and for a moment, you forget to breathe. There is no fury there. No warmth either. Just a kind of vacancy. As if the man once known for commanding cities with a glance has retreated somewhere far beyond the skin he still wears. He spends more time in Persepolis after that. Not ruling, not building, just being there, sitting in the Apadana, staring at the reliefs of tribute bearers, walking the upper terrace before dawn. Occasionally, he calls for a scribe, not to issue decrees, but to dictate strange reflections. Lists of birds he remembers from childhood, verses of prayers no longer recited, names of ships that sank at Salamis, written in neat columns beside those of his ancestors. The scrolls are stored in silence, never read aloud again. Once, you are sent to deliver a sealed message to the queen's chief attendant. You pass through the hall of 100 columns, the hall that Xerxes had ordered built when his reign was still young, still blazing with ambition. You remember how the walls once glowed with fresh pigment, the carvings crisp, the banners bright. Now, dust coats the upper beams. The columns still rise, but they seem to carry more than weight. They carry memory, and they sag with it. There are no new statues of Xerxes erected after his return. No fresh inscriptions carved. The scribes continue their daily duties, of course. Records are still kept. Festivals still occur. Tribute still arrives from the provinces, though some shipments are lighter than they used to be. No one remarks on it. No one wants to draw attention to the fraying edges of empire. One day, you pass the workshop where new ceremonial seals are cast. The craftsman, an old man with hands like cracked wood, is working on a replacement for one of the king's signet rings. You ask what happened to the original. He shrugs and says, he threw it in the fire, said it bore the wrong name. You don't ask which name he meant, his father's or his own. You remain in service, year after year, watching the king's shadow stretch longer across the marble. He rarely speaks in public now. When he does, his voice carries like a memory of thunder, once loud, now distant. The satraps no longer vie to be seated near him. The generals no longer embellish their reports. The scribes no longer write verses in his praise, unless directly ordered. He is still king, still Shahanshah, still divine in the eyes of law and temple. But the people have stopped looking at him like a flame. They look at him now like a relic. And maybe that's what he has become. Not a ruler of the present, but a monument to something that once tried to stretch across the sea and found the water colder than expected. You carry this thought with you as you light the morning lamps in the temple, as you adjust the royal cushion, as you polish the silver bowl that was once used for wine and now gathers dust beneath the high table. Every room in the palace is still his, but none of them echo the way they used to. It's not that he has lost his power. It's that the applause is gone. And power, uncelebrated, becomes a burden no one dares relieve. But even as the king withdraws into silence, the stories about him continue to grow stranger. You begin to hear tales not from court, but from the frontiers, from the places where monuments were once meant to be built. Of bridges lashed by chains, of seas flogged in rage, of mountains carved to bend around the king's will, of a canal through rock that defied nature itself. And suddenly, you begin to wonder, were those stories madness? Or were they the clearest window into what this king truly was? Because if you want to understand a ruler, not the throne, not the crown, but the man beneath it, you must look not at the battles he fought, but at the ones he tried to fight against the world itself. And that brings you to the strangest of them all. A story carved not into marble, but into water. A tale of fury, of bridges, of curses flung at the sea. And a single order: flog the waves until they obey. The wind whips the canvas of your hood as you stand near the water's edge, your sandals half sinking into the churned mud of the eastern shore. Before you stretches the Hellespont, the narrow strait that divides Asia from Europe, a body of water that has always looked more like a suggestion than a border, slender, wind-streaked, and deceptively calm. It does not roar like the Nile or crash like the outer sea. It waits, watches. It is not loud, but it is not passive either. And now, under orders from the King of Kings, it is to be crossed, not by ferry, not by boat, but by bridge. You are among the dozens of attendants brought forward from the inland court to witness the construction, preparation, and final ritual crossings of the royal army. Your job is simple, at least on paper. You carry sealed scrolls between the engineers and the royal stewards, ensuring no measurements are forgotten, no order misunderstood. In truth, you mostly watch and try to stay out of the way. This is not a place for errors. 2 bridges are being built, side by side, spanning nearly a mile across the water. It is a staggering feat, even to someone who has walked the great courtyards of Persepolis and handled gold-stitched banners taller than your own body. The bridges are formed of pontoon ships lashed together by ropes thicker than your leg, their decks overlaid with wooden planks and padded with earth to create the illusion of solid ground. There is something unsettling about them. They move, not violently, not visibly, but just enough to betray the truth that the army will not be crossing land. It will be walking on a lie and hoping the sea doesn't notice. You hear that this is not the first attempt, that a previous bridge had been completed weeks earlier, only to be shattered by a sudden storm that ripped the ropes and scattered ships like leaves. Some of the engineers had wept. Others had fled. A few had been seized. The king had not taken the failure well. The official record, of course, is carefully worded, but the soldiers, the cooks, the water bearers, they tell the real story. That Xerxes stood on the shore, staring into the white-capped waves, his jaw clenched, his cloak snapping in the wind, and then gave an order that no one understood at first. The sea, he said, had committed an act of treason, and it was to be punished. At first, you thought it was just a metaphor, something to mark the occasion. But no, the punishment was real. The ceremony takes place in full view of the court. You are close enough to feel the heat from the braziers set up along the shore. 2 executioners march forward, their whips coiled, their faces blank. A scribe reads from a scroll, not a list of names, but a list of accusations. The Hellespont is charged with disobedience, with rebellion, with challenging the will of the empire. Then, as dozens of officers and stewards look on in silence, the executioners begin to strike the water. The sound is grotesque, not because of the violence, but because of the absurdity. The whips crack against the waves, sending up white spray and little else. The executioners do not flinch. They count the lashes aloud, once, twice, all the way to 300. With each stroke, the scribe records the punishment in ink. You don't know if he believes in it. You don't know if anyone does, but no one questions it. After the whipping, the sea is branded. Heavy irons are heated until they glow and then plunged into the shallows, hissing as they strike. You see steam rise in plumes. You hear one of the priests murmur a prayer under his breath, not for the sea, for the king, as if this moment is not about punishment, but about preservation, about a man declaring that nothing, not even nature, can defy him and remain unchanged. In the following days, the bridges are rebuilt. Faster this time. Better. The ropes are replaced with thicker ones, woven from flax and papyrus, treated with oils and tension. The ships are lashed tighter, their hulls tested for balance, their decks scrubbed and swept and blessed. You watch the engineers work without sleep, without complaint. You wonder if it's fear or pride that drives them. Probably both. The day of the crossing arrives with little fanfare. There is no grand announcement, no trumpet, just a sudden stillness that spreads through the camp like dew. The sun is just rising as the first wave of soldiers begins their march across the water. First the foot soldiers, row upon row, their sandals slapping wood, their shields stacked against their backs. Then come the cavalry, hooves ringing against the planks, the horses snorting uneasily at the smell of the salt and the give of the surface beneath them. You walk behind one of the supply caravans, assigned to a rear unit assisting with scrolls and ceremonial vessels. The bridge creaks beneath you, but holds. You keep your gaze forward, focused on the land ahead. Europe, a new continent, a new war. You do not look down at the sea. You do not test the patience of something that has already been whipped. As you cross the midpoint, a gust of wind cuts across the strait, sending a chill up your spine. The water below shimmers, deceptive in its calm. You wonder if it remembers the lashes. You wonder if it waits for a chance to repay them. But it does nothing. It holds, just as the king intended. When you reach the far shore, the crowd does not cheer. No horns sound. But there is a shift, a collective exhale, a weight released. The impossible has been made real. The King of Kings has crossed the sea on his own terms. And now, everything on the far side must answer to that fact. That night, as the camp settles on European soil, the king lights a brazier himself. You watch from a distance, seeing the flame flare upward as he drops a pinch of resin into the bowl. No words are spoken, but the gesture is clear. He has challenged the gods, the winds, the water, and now it is the mountain's turn. The next obstacle lies to the north, the great promontory of Mount Athos, where the coastline twists like a knife, and the sea has claimed many armies before. But the king has no intention of bending around it. He will dig straight through. The coastline near Mount Athos curves like the blade of a scythe, jagged and defiant, the cliffs rising out of the Aegean like teeth. The wind here never stops. It tears at tents, unrolls scrolls, and carries the scent of pine and brine into every corner of the camp. Soldiers have begun referring to the place in muttered tones, the Cursed Bend or the God-Eater. You only half believe them until you see the monument, a weathered stone block inscribed in 3 languages, honoring the fleet that perished here years before. You run your fingers across the surface as you pass. The names are gone, worn away by the same sea spray that claimed the lives. You don't know exactly how many ships sank here, but the stories all agree on one thing. They didn't stand a chance. The wind funneled down the cliffs, the waves reared up like fists, and the water swallowed them. The sea, it seems, does not like to be crossed, and it certainly doesn't like to be challenged, which is exactly what Xerxes plans to do. He will not march his army around the promontory. He will not send his navy into those waters again. Instead, he will order the sea to part. Or rather, he will order a canal to be carved, a trench through the very spine of Mount Athos, wide and deep enough to carry the king's fleet past the jaws of the storm. It is not the most efficient solution. It is not even a necessary one. But that has never stopped him before. For Xerxes, practicality is only a concern when it aligns with symbolism. This isn't about movement. It's about dominion. You arrive 2 days after the first shovels strike earth. Already, hundreds of workers are toiling in staggered shifts, their bodies moving in waves like the tide they're meant to defy. They come from all over the empire: Egyptians, Phoenicians, Lydians, Babylonians, each group overseen by a cluster of royal engineers and scribes. The canal is divided into sections, and each contingent works furiously to ensure they aren't the ones blamed if it fails. Your role is administrative. You shadow one of the scribes who oversees ration ledgers and labor rotations. It's grueling, thankless work. Every handful of barley, every skin of water, every bundle of rushes used for tents is recorded and tallied. You're expected to monitor morale without speaking too much, to report complaints without escalating them, and to carry orders with your head lowered and your pace quick. Still, you find yourself lingering near the edge of the excavation at every opportunity, watching as the trench grows deeper each day. It is a monstrous thing, this canal, a scar cut into stone and soil, carved not with reverence, but with rage. It is over a mile long and as wide as a broad road, descending at a slope that makes your legs ache just from walking it once. Workers sweat in the sun, coughing from dust and salt, their hands blistered and bleeding. The overseers bark constantly, but no one slows down. They're too afraid. Fear of the king isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it's just a presence, a pressure. Everyone knows Xerxes is watching, not from a tower, not from a chariot, but through the eyes of his stewards and the silence of his scrolls. Every delay is a potential insult. Every misstep, a risk. And no one wants to be the reason the water remains unconquered. When the canal reaches its midpoint, the king arrives to inspect it. You are stationed on the southern rim of the trench that day, holding a water jug and a copy of the latest excavation chart. You see his chariot crest the hill, the horses snorting, the guards fanning out beside him. He steps down without ceremony, wearing a dark tunic and a single band of gold around his neck. He says nothing at first, just walks to the edge of the canal and looks down. The wind grabs at his cloak, the dust clings to his sandals. For a long time, he simply stands there, watching the men below work. Then he speaks, not to an advisor, not to a general, but directly to the water. "You shall be chained," he says, voice low but distinct. "And if you flee again, you shall be filled with rocks." No one moves, no one breathes. The workers do not stop their digging, but you can tell they heard him. Even the horses stand still. The king continues walking along the edge of the canal, inspecting the trenches, the timber supports, the pulleys groaning under the weight of the removed soil. He pauses once to speak to an engineer, who bows so low he nearly topples into the trench. The inspection ends without applause. The king nods once, then departs. But the energy in the camp changes after that. The workers dig faster. The overseers shout less. Something about hearing the king's words directly has shifted the balance. The mountain no longer feels like an opponent. It feels like prey. You spend your days logging tool deliveries and adjusting the scribe tablets when a team falls behind schedule. You begin recognizing faces. An older Egyptian with a tattoo of a falcon on his forearm. A Phoenician boy who hums to himself as he digs. A Babylonian foreman with a limp and a voice like gravel. You bring them water when you can. Offer silence when that's all you have. You don't belong to them. But you stand beside them more often than not. At night, the fires ring the canal like stars fall into earth. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of sweat and stone dust and the occasional breath of pine. You sit near the supply tent, copying measurements by lamplight, and listen to the mountain groan under the weight of transformation. The canal is nearly done, and then one morning it is. The water is released in stages, carefully, slowly, until the trench becomes a channel. The boats slip through like knives through cloth, and the sea has, at last, been bent. There is no whipping this time, no branding, only silence. The king returns, sees the water flow where rock once stood, and turns away. You follow the army as it marshes inland once more. The canal behind you now, a ribbon of salt slicing through the bones of the earth. But even as you walk, you cannot forget the sound of his voice echoing over the trench. You shall be chained. And you begin to wonder, quietly, whether the sea remembers, and whether one day it will pull those chains tight. By the time you begin assisting at the northern section of the Athos Canal, the trench has already devoured much of the hill. It stretches behind you like an open wound, and ahead of you like a challenge that has forgotten how to blink. When you arrive with the latest ration tallies and labor rosters, tucked under your arm in oil-treated scrolls, it almost doesn't feel like a human project anymore. It feels like the mountain itself has been convinced to change its shape. No pleading. No negotiating. Just orders, shouted in a dozen dialects, answered with the scrape of pickaxes against stone. You're not here to dig. That's made clear to you early on. Your place is in the shaded counting tent, where grain is weighed, water is recorded, and lists of names are updated at midday and again at night. But the distance between the trench and your tent is a short one, and the dust doesn't stop at the edge of duty. By your third day, your throat burns constantly, your robes feel stiff with grit, and you've developed the habit of brushing sand from your scrolls before reading them, even indoors. The mountain is in your mouth, your skin, your sleep. The digging is not steady or quiet. It is violent, like surgery done without any pain-killing prayers. The laborers cut in teams, each responsible for a portion of wall or slope, the canal carved downward in long rectangles that step unevenly toward the sea. The heat bakes the stone into sharpness. Even in the shade, tools snap from fatigue. Men stumble from the trench with cracked hands and swollen feet. The overseers rotate them as fast as they dare, careful not to slow progress but trying, in rare moments of mercy, not to lose anyone to collapse. You begin to learn which cries mean injury and which mean frustration. You learn to recognize when a pickaxe has struck stubborn rock. There's a certain rhythm to the blows, followed by a chorus of swearing in 3 different languages. You recognize, too, the rare silence that falls when a section caves inward. It happened on your 4th day. No one died, thank the gods, but 5 men were pulled from the earth like roots, coughing and shaking, their eyes wide with disbelief. For 2 hours, digging stopped. Then, just before sunset, the engineers gave the signal and the picks resumed more cautiously, but with equal urgency. From your ledgers, you know that over 1,500 workers are stationed at the canal site, organized into contingents by region. The Phoenicians are known for their precision, carving the neatest lines. The Egyptians are fast, relentless, singing low songs as they swing their tools. The Anatolians are methodical, better with timber than stone, but strong as oxen. Each group is proud of its section and quietly competitive. You once watched 2 crews continue digging long after sunset, just to avoid falling behind their rivals. No one told them to. The mountain told them not to stop, and the king, even in his absence, was watching through every measurement and every scroll. The engineers walk the length of the trench every morning with their arms folded and their expressions carved from stone. They consult their charts, measure depths, inspect the slant of each ramp. They rarely speak. If something is wrong, they simply scratch a mark into the dirt and walk away. A few hours later, the workers make the correction. No questions, no protests, just the quiet, grinding obedience that has defined the entire project from the beginning. Still, there are moments that break the routine. Once, during a lull, you saw a Babylonian laborer crouch near the edge of the canal and pull a small reed flute from his satchel. He played no more than 3 notes before a Phoenician supervisor barked at him, and the music stopped. But for a moment, the sound had risen above the digging, clean and defiant, as if the mountain itself had paused to listen. Another time, you witnessed a man collapse at the base of the southern wall. He had been working since dawn, his tunic soaked through, his hands shaking from strain. The others didn't shout at him. They didn't drag him away. They simply worked around him, one man placing a cloth over his shoulders, another setting his tools aside. A water skin was passed without words. You watched from the ledger's tent, too far to help, but not too far to feel the weight of it. No orders had been given. No lashes had been threatened. And yet, the work continued because it had to. And always, at the back of your thoughts, was the awareness that this canal was not a necessity. It was a monument to will. Xerxes could have sent his ships around the promontory. He could have ordered the march to bypass the dangerous coast entirely. But that would have meant yielding to nature, to chaos, to the sea that had already humiliated him once. No, this was something else. This was defiance sculpted into stone. It was a trench carved not just into the earth, but into the future. A canal the world would remember as an emperor's answer to a wave. In the evenings, after the last scrolls have been sealed and the ration figures posted, you sometimes walk along the upper edge of the excavation. The fires burn low, the voices of the workers reduced to murmurs. The trench gleams faintly in the moonlight, pale stone flanked by timber scaffolding and lined with shadows. You try to imagine what it will look like when the water is released, when ships glide through it as if down a river that never should have existed. When the king rides along the embankment and looks down, not at the men who made it, but at the canal itself, the proof that he and he alone has bent the world to his liking. But you also think of the other scars you've seen, the whipped sea, the scorched fleets, the palace halls that echo with footsteps that grow fewer by the year. You wonder how much earth must be moved before a man feels satisfied. How many mountains must bow before one remembers that they rise again, eventually. The final digging is completed under torchlight. You are there when the engineers signal the all clear and the workers drop their tools in unison. The silence that follows is the loudest thing you've ever heard. The trench is done. The mountain has yielded. The king, wherever he is that night, will receive the message sealed in wax and marked with 3 stamps. The water will come next. But for now, the mountain sleeps. And you turn away, already bracing for the next order, because when one obstacle falls, the king finds another. The canal is finished, but the march is not. And ahead lies the sea once more. The spring rains come early as the army pushes deeper into Europe, and with them comes the mud. Not the thick, clay-like mud of your homeland's riverbanks, but a cold, clinging sludge that stretches for miles, over fields, between hills, across every ancient path the scouts insisted would hold. It seeps into everything. Your sandals, once sturdy with stitched leather and reinforced soles, now squish with every step. The straps give way after the 3rd day, and by the end of the week, most of the supply scribes are barefoot, their toes coated in gray sludge and wrapped in makeshift cloth. You try not to think about how long your feet have been wet. You try not to think at all. Scrolls are another matter. Wax-sealed, linen-wrapped, bundled with cedarwood rods, they are supposed to be secure, resilient. And yet, you've never seen so many of them collapse in your hands. The wind is the enemy here. It picks up across the plains without warning, lifts the corners of your robe, peels the edges of your records free from their bindings, and sends delicate vellum fluttering like frightened birds. You and the others sprint after them, slipping in the muck, arms flailing in silence because no one dares laugh in front of the royal guard. The king's entourage presses forward, slower now. Supply wagons groan beneath their weight. Horses grow nervous in the open terrain, their hooves sinking into the soft earth. The tent lines are adjusted constantly, stakes redriven, ropes retied, and yet each night they still sag, heavy with collected rain. The hearths struggle to light. Bread turns soggy before it can be eaten. And through it all, the army marches. You share a tent with 5 other court attendants, 2 scribes, a steward's apprentice, and an embalmer who still wears the red-dyed cuffs of his last duty in Sardis. There is barely enough room to sit. Everything smells faintly of wet parchment and wool. At night, the wind scrapes against the canvas like a warning. Sometimes you dream of the sea behind you rising up, crashing through the canal in defiance, swallowing the path you've just carved. And still, the scrolls must be copied. Every day brings new numbers, new inventories, new terrain notes, new corrections to troop formations. The generals argue often, their voices muffled through the flap of the king's command tent. Some want to wait for drier ground. Others speak of omens, unfavorable birds, trembling flames, strange dreams passed between the officers like infection. One day, A satrap throws a map into the mud in frustration. You are sent to retrieve it. The ink has already blurred, but you nod anyway. Wrap it in oilskin and place it back into the record's chest. No one is willing to admit they're losing control. The king remains calm, or at least still. He is seen less often now, appearing briefly each morning to hear reports, before retreating into the largest of the mobile pavilions, flanked by guards in scaled bronze. When he does speak, it's with a tone that refuses argument. Orders are handed down as if carved in marble. The wind and mud may strip the army of speed and pride, but they cannot seem to touch the king's certainty. You begin to notice small rituals forming among the troops. A line of infantrymen taps the hilts of their swords against their shields 3 times before setting off each day. Cavalrymen tuck small tokens into their saddlebags: carved figurines, feathers, pressed herbs. You find yourself doing the same, slipping a broken scroll rod into your sash like a talisman. It's meaningless, of course, but you carry it anyway. Everyone does something. Occasionally, the wind tears through camp with such force that the tents buckle, ropes snap, and entire supply stations are thrown into chaos. One afternoon, a gust lifts the awning over the central command pavilion, sending 2 crates of scrolls skidding across the field. You are one of the 10 assigned to recover them. For hours, you chase fluttering parchments through the flooded meadows, diving into brush, tripping over roots, offering whispered apologies to trees and to gods you haven't named since you were a child. You manage to save 37 of the scrolls. 9 are unrecoverable. 3 were found in a latrine ditch. No one says anything aloud when the count is finished, but a silence settles over the ledger tent for the rest of the evening. One night, as you shelter beneath a broken cart for warmth, the embalmer tells a story about a lost fortress in the west, half sunken into the earth, its walls still echoing with the last orders of its forgotten king. No one speaks when he finishes. The mud seems deeper after that. You find yourself staring out over the darkness, wondering what echoes you'll leave behind, and whether they'll be carved into tablets, or just lost in the wind, like so many of your scrolls. Despite the hardship, the king refuses to delay. The court marches forward, through plains that rot beneath your feet, past villages abandoned at the sound of approaching hooves. Each day, you record numbers, patch scrolls, and press wax seals with fingers that barely bend anymore. The mud becomes part of you. Your sandals are long gone. Your robe is stiff and stained, but you've stopped noticing. Then, one morning, without warning, the ground begins to rise again. You spot it on the horizon, a ridge, then another, then the distant spines of hills where roads disappear into dark forest and uneven stone. You feel the army tense as word spreads. The terrain ahead is rough, narrow, twisted, hard to maneuver, harder to escape. And somewhere beyond those ridges lies a narrow pass with a name already whispered in Greek villages, in Persian strategy councils, and in half-finished inscriptions. Thermopylae, the place where courage, heat, and geography all collide. The scrolls become heavier now, not just with rain, but with implication. You carry them carefully, winding their cords twice, checking seals thrice. Every number written now has a gravity to it. Every map feels like a prediction. And as the army begins its slow crawl toward the cliffs, the wind does not stop, but it does change direction, as if trying to warn you. They move like a shadow that has remembered its body. You hear them before you see them, not because they are loud, but because everything else goes silent in anticipation. Somewhere behind the next ridge, the soil trembles slightly. The boots are felt before they're witnessed. And when they crest the hill at last, row upon row, bronze flashing, spear points like needles lining the morning light, you realize that stories haven't been exaggerated after all. The immortals are real. You've read the inventories, of course. You've helped catalog their weapon shipments, logged their rations, memorized their names, even though none of them speak to you. The Royal Guard, 10,000 strong, always 10,000 strong. When one dies, another replaces him by nightfall, and the ranks remain whole. A moving wall of elite precision. You've seen drawings of their uniforms, sleeved tunics of fine-scale mail, layered robes dyed the color of ripe olives, spears tipped with gold and silver, bows with carved handles, daggers curved like the edge of a wolf's grin. But drawings don't prepare you for the presence of them. The way their formation breathes in rhythm, the way their sandals hit the mud with exactly the same pressure, the same sound, as if they're walking on stone instead of churned earth. Their faces are partly covered, veiled to the cheekbones. You do not see their mouths move, but they hum faintly, a rhythm beneath breath that carries through the forested pass like the tuning of a god's instrument. They are not the first troops to march through Thermopylae, but they are the only ones that make the hills seem to lean back, as if the land itself is rethinking its loyalties. Even the birds fall quiet. You stand at the edge of a supply post, scroll case slung across your back, holding your breath as the first column passes. And then another, and another. You lose count after 8. The immortals don't wear dust like the rest of the army. Somehow, they move through it without absorbing it. Their armor gleams despite days on the road. Their weapons don't jostle. You remember an old steward's whisper back in Persepolis, that some of the guard are not entirely men. That within their ranks are sons of nobles trained from infancy, but also strangers with no past, no families, only orders. That one of them hasn't aged in 30 years. You laugh then. You don't know. For a few days, you're assigned to their provisioning camp. Not close enough to speak to them directly, but near enough to log their consumption patterns and send tallies back to the quartermasters. It's eerily simple. The immortals never request double rations, never fall behind on schedule, never leave behind a single discarded item. Every eating bowl is returned cleaned, every blanket folded with identical precision. Even their refuse is orderly. You wonder how they do it, or why. You wonder if you're watching discipline or something else. Something quieter, something colder. One night, while sorting seal stamps in the shadow of a supply wagon, you overhear a foreign commander mutter to his aide that the immortals are what Xerxes imagines himself to be. Unstoppable, untouched, eternal. You're not sure what he means at first, but later, as you see them forming ranks again under a pale moon, you begin to understand. They do not fear the narrow pass ahead. They do not hesitate like the cavalry, who eye the cliffs nervously, or the archers, who glance up at the ravens gathering in the high trees. The immortals move like Thermopylae is already theirs, as if the enemy has already fled, as if fate, too, wears a bronze helm and marshes in the center of their formation. But even fate requires logistics, and your job is to keep them moving. You haul crates of dried meat, check the oil levels in their lantern tins, ensure the tent assignments are printed with flawless clarity. One smudge on a name, one mistake in the tally, and the camp officials will make you rewrite the entire sheet. You've done that 3 times already, not because you're careless, but because their precision warps the world around them. Everything must match. Even the people around them must adjust. On the 4th day of the approach, the wind rises. It cuts down the pass like a blade, sharp and impatient. The scouts report torchlight, far to the west, enemy movement, though the Greeks remain distant, unseen. But the immortals do not pause. They press forward into the narrowing gorge, their boots landing where stone meets salt marsh, their lines shifting just slightly to adjust to terrain. You walk behind them for a while, your scroll case bouncing at your side. The ground harder here than before. You pass shrines. You pass strange trees twisted by wind. You pass warnings carved in old Greek lettering that the others ignore. You don't know what the words say, but the shape of them suggests caution. Still, the immortals march. And behind them comes the weight of an empire. By now, The King of Kings is only half a day's ride behind. His war tent has been transported along the flat hills to the rear of the force. The moment the pass is secured, he will arrive, and the immortals will have done what they were always intended to do. Not simply protect him, but prepare the world for his gaze. You stop at the ridge that overlooks the narrowest part of the gorge, where the path hugs the rock face and drops steeply to a cold sea. The sun sets behind the cliffs, casting a jagged shadow across the path. You can barely hear the footsteps now, but you feel them in your ribs. You wonder what the Greeks will do. You wonder if they know what's coming. But most of all, you wonder if anything at all, has ever stopped the immortals before. You press your scroll case tighter to your chest and begin the descent into the pass, just as the first torches are lit ahead and a sudden, almost musical stillness settles over the stones. There is no clear moment when the sky begins to change. The light grows gradually dimmer, the air denser, but nothing announces the shift. It arrives without ceremony, without warning, settling over the pass like a hand pressed gently on the back of your neck. At first, it seems like the usual overcast gloom that has followed the army for days, but then the wind stops. Not dies down, stops. The branches of the sparse trees surrounding Thermopylae no longer sway. The grasses fall still. Even the breath of the horses seems to tighten, as though something unspoken has moved into their lungs. You pause in your task, sealing the latest roster of supply carts, and look up to see the first flicker of distant lightning just behind the hills. The thunder doesn't follow right away. When it finally does, it rolls slowly, as if considering whether to announce itself or not. It is not the sharp crack of a sudden storm, but a long, weighty groan that seems to rise from the cliffs rather than the clouds. You hear it again a few minutes later, this time louder, more deliberate, and you realize it's not simply thunder from the sky, but also from the land itself, echoing through the stone, bouncing off the narrow walls of the pass, shaking the soles of your feet like a distant drum. Around you, the men have gone quiet. Even those used to marching in tight formation or shouting across supply yards have stilled. There is something uncanny in the hush that follows thunder that doesn't seem to end. It curls around the army, invisible but pressing, like the air before a predator pounces. The cooks stop stirring their pots. The scribes hold their styluses mid-word. No one names what they feel, but it settles into each of them just the same. Within the gorge, the narrow path tightens. The Greek terrain has conspired to form a natural bottle. The rocks lean inward, jagged and irregular. The cliffs on either side, creating a corridor barely wide enough for two carts to pass. It's a place that invites myths and ambushes in equal measure. And now, as the army waits for the king to arrive, everyone senses what the maps could never quite convey. You look up at the overhanging ridges and wonder who might already be watching. The Greek forces have not made themselves fully known, but scouts have reported torchlight at night, movement among the trees, tracks that disappear at the riverbed. No one has engaged yet, not officially, but the mountain feels inhabited, not just by men, perhaps, but by defiance itself. Commanders argue in quiet corners, their voices low and fast. No one dares raise their tone in front of the gorge. The pass doesn't tolerate arrogance. The army, once a procession of absolute confidence, now seems hesitant to inhale too loudly. The drums are struck less often. Orders are barked with less force. You overhear one veteran whisper that the king should have waited, that the omens were unclear, that the winds shifted too early in the season. You tuck that observation away with the rest of your sealed scrolls, not because it's official, but because it might matter later when someone demands to know why things unraveled. And then it happens. A trumpet call rises from the eastern end of the gorge, sharp and immediate. The soldiers stiffen. You see movement just beyond the bend where the road narrows, the flutter of a cloak, the glint of a shield. Then another sound, not metal striking metal, but the echo of shouting, measured, deliberate, a call and response rhythm that climbs quickly in intensity. You hear the clash of weapons shortly after, sudden and fast. The Greeks have not waited for the king. They've chosen their moment, and they are not stalling. They are striking. The immortals react first. You watch as they begin to move in formation, pushing through the tight corridor with remarkable coordination. But even they must break rank to navigate the terrain. The rocks do not bend to precision. They refuse symmetry. The immortals try to maintain their rhythm, but the cliffs break their line. The fighting begins in earnest, and the sound of it floods the pass. Blades scraping shields, screams forced through clenched teeth, the groaning impact of bodies slammed against stone. You clutch your scroll case tightly and find yourself stepping back, not in fear, but in awe. You have never seen the immortals falter, and yet here they are slowed, not by superior force, but by the unforgiving nature of the land. The king has not yet arrived. His command pavilion is still being assembled along the safer stretch behind the pass, and he remains unaware that the battle he expected to conquer in mere hours has already become a storm. Messengers gallop through the camp, delivering orders and receiving new ones that contradict the last. Supplies are shifted, then returned. Officers shout names with more urgency now, and the scribes begin rewriting marching orders before the first versions are even dry. You try to hold your place beneath the nearest canopy, shielding your papers from the rising wind, but everything around you feels unstable. The thunder above returns, louder this time. Lightning forks across the mountain peaks, briefly illuminating the scene below. In the flash, you see the line of Persian archers pulling back from the gorge's edge. You see the immortals adjusting, attempting to pivot around a newly formed barricade. You see confusion spreading like oil through water, and you realize, with sudden clarity, that no one, not even the royal guard, knows what happens next. The whispers begin almost immediately, that Leonidas is among the Greeks, that they number only a few hundred, that they hold the pass by sheer will and the favor of the gods, that the earth shakes not from rain or footsteps, but from the fury of men who refuse to fall. You don't know if any of it is true. It doesn't matter. In war, truth arrives last. Fear arrives first, and it's already here. As the battle grows fiercer, the sky finally opens. Rain pours across the camp, turning the dirt to clay, blurring the lines between path and field. Scrolls slip from hands. Wax seals melt into rivulets. Ink runs like blood. You stuff your remaining documents into your case and retreat behind a cart for shelter. You are no soldier, no hero, no torch-lit silhouette in a war poem. You are one of the quiet ones, those who carry numbers and words. But even you can feel that something has gone terribly off course. This was meant to be a display, a procession, a march of inevitability. Instead, it has become a trial. You close your eyes and listen to the thunder as it folds itself into the rhythm of war. You think of the courtyards of Persepolis, where fountains sing and incense drifts through archways. You remember the coolness of stone beneath your sandals and the way whispers never carried there. Here, everything is loud. Not just the storm, but the realization that the king has met resistance he cannot simply punish into silence. And that realization, too, will travel, because eventually someone will take this story back to the palaces, to the sunlit halls of Susa, and Persepolis, to the women behind the veils and the advisors behind the lattice screens. It will arrive not in victory, but in fragments, whispers, scrolls, bruised messengers, and tarnished silver. There, where words carry more weight than armor, and glances can command the future, the aftermath of this battle will be measured not in distance marched, but in prestige lost. And so, we leave the past behind now. The spears and the thunder, the shouts and the storm. We step beyond the gorge and into the hushed corridors of power, where the war has not yet reached, but where its shadow has already begun to fall. You wake to the sound of water, not thunder. A soft bubbling of a fountain, just beyond a carved window screen, fills the quiet space between dreams and daylight. There is no mud here, no smoke, no clatter of armor or barked orders. Only the slow sigh of silk brushing polished floors, and the occasional rustle of palm fronds stirred by a tame morning breeze. For a moment, you forget where you are. The air smells of saffron and myrrh. Your sandals sit untouched beside a basin of rosewater, waiting. And the scroll case, so often heavy against your back, is gone. Left at the entrance like an unnecessary memory. You've been summoned to the gardens of the Queen Mother, not for punishment, not for praise, but for something more subtle. Information. The battle at Thermopylae is over, but in this place, the story is just beginning to be told. And you, a servant of letters, a quiet observer among louder men, have seen things enough to be of interest to those who speak not in commands, but in implications. You were delivered here at dusk 2 days ago, pulled from the rear supply encampment without explanation, and told to wait. And now, as the sun filters through latticed windows shaped like flowers, your waiting ends. The palace garden is nothing like the outside world. The sounds are curated, the smells intentional, the shadows placed with care. Cypress trees line the marble walkways like green torches pointing skyward, and the hedges curve in gentle spirals, framing smaller courtyards tucked away like secrets. The birds here do not call. They trill, softly, as if trained to harmonize with the water channels that paving stones. You walk slowly, not from fatigue, but from caution. You are not supposed to be here. Not exactly. This space belongs to those whose influence does not carry banners or wear armor, but who still control the tempo of the empire. Ahead, a cluster of figures sits beneath a colonnade draped in sheer linens. Their voices are soft, but their presence is unmistakable. These are the women of the court, not concubines, not idle wives, but sisters, mothers, and daughters of governors, generals, and kings. Their influence is the kind that moves without being seen, shaping futures with gestures and glances. And you, scroll-bearer and silent courier, are here because your eyes have seen something their ears are waiting to hear. A steward gestures for you to kneel at the edge of the tiled platform, not on the cool stone itself, but on a fixed square of embroidered cloth laid out for the purpose. It smells faintly of jasmine and ink. You kneel, as instructed, and lower your gaze. There is no need to look directly at anyone here. The questions will come regardless. They do not ask about the bodies. Not directly. They do not ask for numbers or lists or declarations of victory. Their inquiries drift sideways, woven through metaphors and half-formed statements. The king's patience is thinner in the mountains, they say, murmurs one. And the sea was not kind to our banners this year. Another smiles without smiling and remarks that the Greeks must be very devout to risk so much for so little. You understand what they mean. They are testing you. Not your loyalty, but your precision. You answer as you must, carefully. The immortals performed with discipline. The terrain was unforgiving. The Greeks held the pass longer than expected. The king's fury was contained, but visible. You omit the chaos. You leave out the mutterings among the officers. The blood you saw on the spear of a boy no older than 16. The way the wind turned as if disgusted with your side of the line. You are not here to tell the whole truth. You are here to speak the version of truth that allows the palace to adjust its posture without revealing that it staggered. A servant pours chilled pomegranate water into a glass bowl and places it beside you without a word. You do not touch it yet. You've heard rumors about these gardens, how some visitors leave with garlands and others with silence. But most who come leave lighter. Not in burden, but in influence. They are allowed to disappear. Did the king speak often during the march? Asks one of the women, her fingers trailing the edge of a silver fan. You hesitate. It is not a dangerous question, but it is a revealing one. The answer they want isn't about volume. It's about mood. You respond that the king gave few direct orders, but that his presence altered the rhythm of the camp. That silence became obedience. That the men spoke more quietly near him. That the air seemed to lean in when he passed. This answer satisfies them, or at least gives them something to whisper about later. You still haven't been told why you were brought here, and you suspect you never will be. Eventually, the questions end. Not because they are finished, but because the sun has risen to the point where even the veils, fluttering around the pavilion, can't quite protect the women's skin from its full heat. One by one they drift away, back into the shaded wings of the palace, where oil lamps still burn, and censers swing gently on golden chains. Only one figure remains seated beneath the colonnade. You recognize her by reputation, if not by face, the Queen Mother. Her gaze is steady, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She does not speak, but she watches you with a kind of stillness that feels more potent than words. When she finally rises, it is with no signal, no servant summoned. She simply stands, and all those nearby shift slightly in response. A breeze stirs the garden. The water in the nearest fountain ripples gently, distorting the reflection of the sky above. You're dismissed without ceremony, but you know better than to mistake this for a lack of consequence. You have just walked through a part of the empire more powerful than an army, and far harder to predict. And as you pass under the shade of a date palm and back into the inner corridor, you catch the faintest murmur from behind the curtain. Not your name, just the word Thermopylae, spoken like a question that no one is ready to answer. The scent of incense follows you into the halls. The garden recedes behind you, but its presence lingers, like a secret half whispered into the folds of your robe. You return to your chamber changed, not visibly, not officially, but marked all the same. In the world of the elite, words travel in strange shapes, and you've just become one of them. As the door slides shut behind you, you realize it's not over. The war continues, yes, but more importantly, the narratives are still being chosen. And tomorrow, perhaps you'll be called to the library, where another kind of power resides. The kind that decides what parts of history are written in ink, and which are left to the gardens to whisper. The day begins not with sunlight, but with wax. Warm, faintly perfumed wax poured into small clay bowls and tilted until the surface smooths over like glass. You've watched this process before, seen the scratch of stylus against soft resin, the careful indentation of names and quantities and places. But today, the wax is for you, or minor precisely, for your knowledge. What you saw on the Western Front has become a matter of accounting, not emotion, not valor, just numbers. You are escorted into the records chamber by a pair of slender guards, their uniforms spotless, their eyes pointed forward with practiced disinterest. The hall they lead you through is unlike the rest of the palace. Here, the ceilings are lower, the light more filtered. Long slats of sunlight fall across benches and desks, illuminating stacks of tablets and scrolls that lean at deliberate angles, like soldiers drilled into stillness. The air smells of cedar and ink, not the sharp ink of hasty camp records, but something older, slower, used only in rooms where words are meant to last. The eunuch sits near the center of the chamber. You don't know his name. No one says it aloud. He is not a man of ceremony or decoration, but of permanence. His robe is plain, his jewelry limited to a single carved seal, worn on a leather thong around his neck. Yet everyone who passes him bows, even slightly, even if they think no one is looking. In a palace filled with veiled glances and unspoken influence, his is the kind that never needs to raise its voice. And today, he wants to hear from you. He does not ask for stories. He wants entries. The number of horses lost in the mountain pass. The crates of arrows consumed before reinforcements arrived. The delay caused by a flooded road. and whether it was sabotage or simply spring runoff. He asks about the water rations, whether they held, whether the silver was properly distributed, whether any record of discontent crossed your eyes as you passed among the scribes. You answer carefully, not because you're hiding anything, but because you know how little it takes to alter the tone of a report. A single word, excessive, insufficient, questionable, can shift the path of funding, shift the future of a satrap's son, shift the placement of an officer whose father believes himself untouchable. Around the room, other scribes copy your answers into clay and parchment, a web of silent industry that turns the events of war into neat rows of accounting. This is where the empire's shape is carved, not in the marble columns of the king's court, not in the jeweled laughter of the garden pavilions, but in ledgers like these, where history is measured in figs, sandals, and the frequency of illness in a camp of 10,000. The eunuch does not smile. He does not frown. His hand never trembles. When he speaks, it is with the still cadence of someone who has outlived 30 seasons of shifting favor. He asks if you've ever seen a soldier eat honey to delay fainting. You nod. He notes it. He asks if there were discrepancies between what the generals reported and what the scribes recorded. You admit there were. You don't elaborate. He does not press. You begin to realize why he summoned you. The palace doesn't want stories. It wants patterns. And you, having stood between two halves of the empire, its mouth and its stomach, are one of the few who can trace the invisible lines. You saw who received the most food, who got the dry tents, who was sent first, and who was held back. You witnessed the names shouted in praise during the king's inspections, and those quietly left out when wine was passed around the fire. You know who risked everything and who merely watched. He doesn't need all the details. He needs the shape of the truth. That's what his ledger is for. And today, your voice sharpens its edge. You are dismissed hours later with nothing but a nod. No wax seal, no silver plate. Just the subtle release of duty and the knowledge that the room now holds a version of your memory, distilled, dissected, and shelved. The halls outside feel wider than before. You walk slowly, unsure of where to go. No one told you to report back to your quarters. No one asked for you in the gardens. The king himself is still away, or at least not visible. His movements through the palace are now more rumor than record. Some say he's in mourning for a trusted commander. Others whisper he's in planning chambers, drawing new lines on a golden map. Still others suggest he's simply waiting. You pass a pair of younger scribes discussing the fleet. They wonder aloud if the Athenians are regrouping. One says the king should burn every port from Ionia to the west. The other warns that fires don't float. Their voices fade behind you as you reach the columned walkway leading toward the quieter wing of the palace, where statues of former kings look out over an enclosed courtyard of shade-loving flowers. The silence here is deeper, touched only by the faint swish of sandals on stone and the soft ticking of time as marked by the drip of water from a marble basin into a shallow bowl. You find a bench and sit for a while, not out of fatigue, but reflection. The war is not over, yet the pages of it are already being written, not just by victors, but by survivors, by record keepers, by those who understand that memory is malleable and that empires aren't only held together by gold and soldiers, but by names that appear, unremarkable, repeated, on the ledger of a eunuch in a windowless room. And as you rest there, in the shadow of carved lions and fig trees, a new awareness settles in. You have spoken to both sides of the palace now, to the women who whisper power through petals and perfumes, and to the man who binds truth into clay. And tomorrow, someone else will call for you, because the veil behind the throne is not a single curtain. It is many, layered, and shifting, and you have just passed through another. You don't expect to be summoned again so soon, certainly not by her. But when the steward arrives at your door with a scroll, bearing the faint perfume of blue lotus and instructions in a hand too elegant to question. You don't hesitate. You recognize the seal. It is not the king's, not the queen mother's. It belongs to someone whose name is rarely spoken aloud, and when it is, it's often followed by lowered voices and careful glances. She is neither wife nor regent, yet her opinions weigh heavily on both. You are told only to bring a clean stylus and to wear no fragrance. That last detail, oddly specific, feels more telling than any title. It means this will not be a public event, not a banquet, not a record review, not even a whispering garden conversation. This is something else. The steward leads you not toward the royal court, but to a quiet part of the eastern palace, where the windows narrow and the walls are lined with soft tapestry instead of mosaic. Here, the air smells not of incense or saffron, but of pressed reed paper and old ink. The silence is different, too, thicker, like a woven shawl pulled close around the halls to keep their secrets warm. You are ushered into a chamber you've never seen before. It's shaped like a shell, with arched alcoves carved into the walls, each lined with scroll racks and shelves of wooden tablets. At the center, instead of a throne, there are cushions, plain but thick, and a single low table bearing only two items, a bowl of fresh figs and an open codex, half filled with notes in the same careful hand as your summons. You do not know what this room is called. No one told you. But it feels older than the rest of the palace, more deliberate, as though it was built not for power, but for the quiet work of making sense of it. She enters without entourage, barefoot, her robe the color of a stormy dawn. No jewels, no veil, just a glint of silver in her hair, and the unmistakable ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Long before she's finished speaking, she doesn't introduce herself. She doesn't need to. There are things that aren't written down, she says, settling opposite you with the ease of ritual. But they should be. I'd like you to write one of them. You nod, stylus already in hand, and wait. She begins with a name, not hers. A girl's. A girl from the western provinces who arrived at court at the age of 7. Quiet, observant, quick with numbers. She was not royal, not even noble, but she had a knack for mapping trade routes in her head, and once memorized the entire grain yield of Elam, after hearing it recited only once. The queen, one of the lesser ones, she adds with a flick of her fingers noticed. And so, the girl was placed in a small, hidden school. There are others, she explains. Silver daughters, they're sometimes called, though never allowed. Girls of talent rather than title. Chosen not for marriage, but for minds. Their education is precise, rigorous, and entirely unacknowledged in public. They learn court arithmetic, languages, statcraft, and law. Not the laws carved into stele for the public to see, but the unwritten codes that govern where power actually flows. They read poetry, not just for beauty, but for cipher. They recite lineage charts backward and forward, and practice signing names they'll never be allowed to claim in ink. You glance around the chamber now and see it differently. The alcoves are arranged not at random, but by theme, governance, logistics, trade, diplomacy. It is a classroom, but one wrapped in velvet and silence. You realize what this is, an invisible academy of empire. They will never be generals, she says. Never satraps. But they will write the letters. Those men are too proud to write themselves. They will speak through husbands who think they've had a clever idea. They will manage debts, arrange favors, and remember the details no commander ever can. They will keep the empire from becoming too loud to listen to itself. She gestures toward the open codex on the table. It contains what looks like a roster. You don't recognize the names, but next to each is a series of phrases. Fluent in Median and Elamite, recites treaties by memory, sews but forgets to embroider, suspicious of flattery, not grades, not rankings, portraits. These girls will never have statues, she says. but they'll shape the men who get them. The lesson is not for the girls, you realize. It's for you. She is telling you what to record, or at least, what not to forget. You ask, carefully, how many of these schools exist? More than the king knows, she replies. A pause follows. You are not sure if it's an invitation or a warning. Perhaps both. The hour passes with stories, anecdotes of girls who shaped negotiations by choosing when not to serve wine, who nudged an entire court into realignment by suggesting a single change to a seating chart. One who caught an error in a Babylonian grain contract that saved the empire a year's worth of shipment loss, and another who whispered a correction into a prince's ear just before he delivered a speech that would be copied across the provinces for a decade. None of their names will ever be listed among royal advisors, but their ink is on everything. She closes the codex at last and hands you a separate wax tablet, blank. Your task, she says, is not to write their names, but to describe the shape of the space they occupy. What it feels like to sit in a room no one acknowledges, learning power that must be used without ever being seen. You accept the assignment with a nod, though it feels less like a task and more like an inheritance. And as she stands and disappears into a side passage so discreet, it blends with the pattern of the wall, you remain seated, stylus hovering, thinking not just about what you will write, but how many other stories like this are already hidden behind walls you never knew to knock on. Outside, the palace is waking. But here, the silence is purposeful. In this hidden school, the sun is not yet high enough to burn the lessons away. And you, once a simple scroll carrier, are now part of a deeper current, one that runs beneath the garden whispers, beneath the eunuch's ledgers, beneath the king's fury. The current that holds it all together. You're invited to watch a game. Not through decree or ceremony, but by way of a quiet nod, an informal gesture from a figure draped in understated silk and cloaked in quiet authority. The kind of invitation you don't receive twice. You don't decline either. Not when it comes from one of the seven, the old noble houses with roots wrapped so deeply around the throne they no longer need titles to hold power. In the Persian court, a whispered summons often speaks louder than a gold-plated edict. The chamber is tucked deep within the administrative wing, past scroll vaults and lacquered map rooms. Its doors are cedar, polished so smooth they catch the light like still water. You've never been inside? Most haven't. The room beyond opens like a jewel box, soft carpets underfoot, walls lined with painted wood, and a broad ivory and ebony board set between two low benches carved with stylized lions. The scent is something clean and quiet, fig leaves, dry cedar, a whisper of cardamom clinging to old robes. It is not chess, not quite. Chatro, they call it here. Its rules shift by region, and the shapes of the pieces speak their own dialects. Elephants instead of bishops, chariots instead of rooks, and a vizier instead of a queen. The game has existed long enough to develop its own metaphors, its own lessons, most of them unspoken, but universally understood among those who play it in these circles. 7 men sit around the board, each with a goblet within reach, but none in hand. They don't drink while they play. Drinking would blur the edge of calculation, and this game is not about leisure. It's theater, masked as diversion. It's an audition, a council, a debate. There are no courtiers here. These are satraps, the provincial governors who hold the empire together, not with armies, but with balance. They are the kind of men who could raise 20,000 spearmen with a scroll and a seal, and just as quickly make them disappear. You're placed near the edge of the room, a respectful distance from the board, but within full view of the pieces. One of the players, an older man with iron-gray curls and ink-stained fingertips, glances your way just once. That's all it takes for you to understand. Your presence is being measured, not for your judgment, but for your memory. The game begins slowly. A camel moves, a horse shifts, a pawn, shaped like a humble foot soldier, crosses the second rank with calculated innocence. But no one truly cares about the pieces. It's the conversation draped around them that matters. They talk about roads and river levels, about the price of barley in Bactria, and a sudden shortage of tin near Sardis. On the surface, it's just commerce. But beneath it lies the undercurrent of loyalty and control. A satrap's ability to keep roads clear and warehouses full says more about his allegiance than any oath sworn in public. These governors are always listening, but rarely agreeing. That's not the point. The point is watching who blinks when a name is mentioned. Occasionally, a hand hovers over the board, hesitating. The pause becomes part of the statement. When one satrap sacrifices his chariot, the room doesn't breathe for 3 beats. Not because of the move, but because of what it implies, that he's willing to give up control of the western granaries to curry favor with someone across the Zagros. A real trade is being signaled, disguised as wood and ivory. They discuss the war only in passing. Xerxes is not named. He is the voice from the summit or our eastern wind. The satraps do not mock or question him, but their euphemisms suggest a quiet distance. You realize the throne is not their battlefield. It's their weather. Unpredictable, powerful. Something to be watched and managed, but not directly opposed. They don't compete with the king. They outlast him. And then, between moves, one of them asks you a question. Not loud, but firm. Tell me, how long did the soldiers wait at the Hellespont before the bridge is held? You answer with the figure you remember, though your voice feels small in this heavy room. The satrap nods slowly and looks down at the board. A pawn advances. The others exchange glances, just flickers. What passed between them isn't spoken, but understood. That delay, the days of waiting, of crossing anxiety, means something to them. Not in military terms, but in time lost. Trade delayed. Harvest windows missed. Letters from Athens that might arrive too late to act upon. The empire runs on timing, and war throws it off by weeks. Another satrap chimes in, his voice like brushed sand. The roads into Lydia are softer this year. The rains came early. That means troops will travel slower, or shipments will spoil. It's a warning, dressed as trivia. A new piece is moved. The king is exposed, but no one says it. You're no longer sure if you're watching the game or part of it. Perhaps both. Your presence here suggests influence, but not ownership. You're the thread that carries information from one part of the court to another. From the scribes' halls to the garden's whisperers. From the eunuch's quiet orders to the silver daughter's silent schools. You are becoming a courier of consequence, even if no one yet speaks your name aloud in these circles. One satrap, younger than the others, but already furrowed by strategy, leans back as the match draws toward its quiet end. He speaks not to you, but in your direction. You don't win this game by protecting your king, he says. You win it by making sure no one wants to kill him in the first place. There's no laughter. Just a soft clink of goblets meeting their trays and the sound of cushions shifting as the men begin to rise. The game has no finality, no declaration. Just a subtle dispersal, like fog slipping off a warm morning field. The match is done, and decisions have been made, but none will be traced back to this room. You're escorted out in silence, your sandals whispering across the patterned floor. Outside, the sun is dipping low, casting lattice-shaped shadows across the walkway. You don't speak. You don't need to. You've been allowed to witness the invisible gears that turn behind the grandeur of Persian rule. Not swords, not banners, not grand speeches, but this. Strategy whispered over carved elephants and traded with glances. By the time you return to your quarters, a note has already been slid beneath your door. Unsealed, unlabeled, it simply reads, "Return to the garden by morning." There's something more you need to understand. The board, it seems, isn't finished. And neither are you. You awaken early, not to sound or summons, but to a silence that feels deliberate. Something has shifted. The air holds the hush of expectation, like a scroll waiting to be unrolled. You rise without hesitation, dressing quickly in the soft robes you've grown accustomed to. The hall outside is still cloaked in sleep, the stone cool beneath your feet, the light of dawn just beginning to slip into the palace's high windows. You move without being told where to go. Your path feels already chosen, as if steps taken yesterday have rippled forward into today. When you reach the outer colonnade of the Queen Mother's garden, you expect to be met by someone official, perhaps a steward or a messenger bearing sealed instructions. Instead, a silent servant stands already in place, the same woman who brought you through the garden days ago. She offers no words, only a glance, and turns and walks along a narrow passage to the west. You follow. This part of the palace is unfamiliar, curved in strange angles that break the symmetry of the grand halls. The windows are narrower here, the ceilings lower, the light softer. The air smells faintly of beeswax and myrrh. At the end of a quiet corridor, you reach a door like any other in the palace. It is small, inset with polished bronze, and bears no mark or royal insignia. The servant opens it with a firm but careful motion, then steps aside. You enter alone. Inside, the light hits you first, not in brightness, but in complexity. The room is covered in mirrors, but not the smooth sheets you'd expect. Instead, it is a mosaic of hundreds, maybe thousands of fragments. Polished metal, slices of bronze and silver, slivers of colored glass, all angled deliberately. The pieces are not meant to reflect you clearly, but to capture you in parts. An eye here, a shoulder there, a silhouette echoed 10 times over. The chamber feels less like a room and more like a prism that's been turned inside out. And then you see her. The Queen Mother is already present, standing with her back to you as she trails her fingers along one wall, letting them slide lightly across the patterned surface. She does not startle or turn quickly when you enter. Instead, she finishes her circuit with quiet gravity, then turns to face you as if she has known all along that you would arrive exactly now at this precise slant of light. There are places, she says, where the truth is not spoken but reflected. Her voice is calm, even, but not unfeeling. She gestures for you to step forward, and you obey, crossing the room slowly. Each step shifts the light, creating ripples of movement in the walls. The mirrors do not reflect you as one person, but as many versions, tall, small, stooped, strong. You are distorted and multiplied, made both larger and smaller than you are. It's strangely humbling. This room was not built for vanity, she says. That is what most men assume when they hear of it. They believe I come here to see myself. She pauses, then points to one fragment, a dull bronze triangle no larger than her palm. But I come here to see what they do when they think no one is looking. This chamber shows angles they forget to account for. Every whisper carries farther than they imagine. Every look is caught somewhere. You begin to understand that the mirror room is not a sanctuary. It's a tool, a surveillance chamber woven in artistry, where power is exercised through stillness and memory rather than noise. The fragments are aligned not to flatter, but to observe. Some reflect doorways or corridors beyond your immediate view. Others capture sunlight at exact hours, bathing parts of the room in sudden brightness when the time is right. It is a space that remembers. She walks again, this time slower, circling the center where a modest cushion rests. The satraps think they rule through scrolls and taxes. The generals believe they shape history with soldiers and strategy. But history is often decided in rooms like this, in conversations too quiet to record, in decisions weighed behind glass. You stand silent, listening, absorbing. Her words aren't a performance. She speaks the way one might tend a garden, carefully, pruning away unnecessary growth, choosing what to let bloom. You've been watching, she says. Good, but you must also remember to listen to your own silence. People will speak around you, to you, at you, but the reflections, they speak about you. She kneels at the center of the room, motioning for you to join her. The floor is cool, the cushion firm beneath your knees. She opens a small scroll box, revealing a set of tokens, smooth stones carved with names. Some are names of satraps. Some are not. She places one, a flat oval etched with a single character, into your hand. This name, she says, is not spoken outside this room, not yet, but you must know it. Because soon, the choice to say it or not will fall to you. You don't ask what it means. You've learned by now that meaning reveals itself only when needed. You hold the token lightly, its weight surprisingly present for such a small thing. She smiles faintly, the closest to warmth she's shown, and gathers the remaining tokens back into the box. When mirrors are cleaned, they do not forget what they once reflected, she murmurs. They only wait to reflect again. The light begins to shift. The room grows warmer as the sun rises higher, catching more of the glass and filling the chamber with threads of gold and silver. Your reflection blurs and settles, a single figure now, centered in 1,000 panes. She rises, not abruptly, but with practiced ease, and gestures toward the door. You may go, she says. The final room waits. You step back into the hallway, your thoughts echoing in rhythm with your footsteps. What you carry is not just the token, not just the knowledge, but something quieter and heavier. The sense that the palace does not run only on protocol or bloodlines, but on reflections, carefully curated, deliberately shaped, and never forgotten. And ahead, as the final hallway unfolds before you, lies the last chamber. One more room, one more whisper in the great mirror of empire. Evening folds over Persepolis, like a velvet curtain pulled slow across the sky, dulling the golden edges of the palace and softening the day's final echoes. The last merchants have packed their wares from the outer courtyards, their voices fading into the distance like prayers carried on wind. You walk without being summoned, though your path is clear, as if drawn by some invisible thread that has been pulling at you all day. The corridor ahead stretches longer than usual, its familiar proportions somehow altered by the dying light that seeps through high windows. The servants have withdrawn to their quarters, melting into the shadows like water finding its level. The officials have scattered, their urgent conversations dissolved into the private chambers where real decisions are made after the public theater ends. Even the courtyards, so often filled with the gentle percussion of dame pieces on wooden boards and the low murmur of gossip, feel paused, as if the very air has learned to hold its breath. You follow the sound of your own footsteps until it feels like even they have learned to tread with care, each placement deliberate, reverent. The palace around you settles into its evening skin. Torches flicker to life in their bronze holders, casting dancing shadows that transform familiar walls into something foreign, mysterious. The marble beneath your feet still holds the day's warmth, but cooler now, welcoming the night's embrace. Somewhere in the distance, a door closes with the soft finality of silk falling to the floor. You pass chambers where lamplight spills through partially open doors, revealing glimpses of private worlds. A scribe bent over scrolls, his shadow enormous on the wall behind him. A guard methodically polishing his spear point until it gleams like captured starlight. An elderly woman arranging flowers in a silver bowl, each bloom placed with the precision of prayer. These are the palace's quieter citizens, the ones who remain when the grand performances end. The corridor you enter now has never welcomed you before. Not by decree, there are no posted restrictions, no guards barring passage, but by instinct, by some unspoken understanding that certain paths wait for their proper moment. The stones here are older, their surface worn smooth not by age alone, but by the passage of feet that have walked with purpose, with weight. The torches burn differently here too, their flames steadier, as if the very air has learned stillness. The bronze lions emerge from the shadows gradually, like thoughts taking shape in a dreaming mind. They are magnificent, each standing as tall as a man, their manes carved with such detail that torchlight seems to move through the metal strands like wind through grass. Their eyes are not painted, but polished to such a gleam they catch and hold every flicker of flame, making them appear not just alive, but aware. They don't glare with the fierce warning of guardians. They watch with the patient attention of witnesses, of judges who have already heard all the arguments and now simply observe. Between them stands a doorway framed in stone that predates the rest of the palace. The marble here is different, darker, denser, carved with a script that flows like water frozen midstream. Even the oldest scribes cannot transcribe these symbols anymore. They are not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something between, a language that speaks to understanding rather than knowledge. For a moment, you wonder if you should hesitate, but your hand lifts anyway, and the door yields under your touch like it was waiting for you. The bronze is warm, as if heated by invisible flames, and it swings open with perfect silence. Inside, the air shifts immediately. The temperature doesn't change, but the feeling does, like stepping from sunlight into shadow, or from wakefulness into the space just before sleep. The walls curve inward, forming a dome that rises into darkness above. There are no windows here to catch the fading sun, no openings to the world above. This chamber exists apart from day and night, from seasons and weather. In the center burns a fire, not decorative, not ceremonial, but alive in its own quiet rhythm. It burns low, but not dim. The flame dances within a carved basin ringed in dark stone, the edges smoothed by time and countless hands that have reached toward its warmth. The stone is volcanic glass, black as midnight, but shot through with veins of silver that catch the firelight and throw it back in unexpected directions. 3 figures occupy worn places around the basin, their faces unfamiliar, yet somehow expected. They are not young, but their age seems less about years than about depth, as if they have absorbed so much silence that it has settled into their bones. Their robes are simple but fine, the kind of cloth that speaks of quiet wealth, of resources devoted not to display, but to comfort during long hours of stillness. They do not speak as you enter. Instead, they simply shift slightly, creating space for a 4th presence, and gesture to the open area across the fire. You cross the chamber and settle onto the cushion that waits there. It is firm but warm, shaped by the weight of many who have sat here before you, each leaving their own small impression. The flame between you snaps gently, as though acknowledging your presence, but not demanding anything just yet. You study the chamber in the dancing light, its walls bare of decoration save for the natural patterns in the stone, its ceiling lost in shadow above. The light doesn't reflect off the dark marble, as it does elsewhere in the palace. Here, it is absorbed, transformed into something softer. Minutes pass in perfect silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, the kind that exists when there is so much to say that words become inadequate. You feel the press of stories in the air around you, narratives that have accumulated in this space, like sediment in a river bend. These are not the tales told in the great halls above, not the official histories carved in stone. These are the other stories, the ones that happen in the spaces between events. Finally, one of them speaks. His robe is patterned with constellations stitched in thread, so fine it appears to be actual starlight captured and woven into fabric. When he moves, the stars shimmer and dance, creating the illusion of a night sky wrapped around his shoulders. His voice is dry but not harsh, steady as water finding its course over stones. "This is the place beneath," he says, and each word falls into the silence like a stone into deep water. Not in stone or status, but in memory. Not below the palace, but below the understanding. The figure to his left nods slowly, a gesture that seems to ripple through the air, like the surface of a disturbed pool. His fingers are stained with ink and ash, marked by years of writing words that were never meant for public consumption. Above, the palace holds thrones and mirrors, he continues, gold that reflects and marble that endures. But below, it holds embers. What you burn here stays, not as ash, but as essence. What you release here takes root. Their words settle slowly, like snow on still water. No rush, no expectation of immediate understanding. Only truth offered like water to the thirsty, to be received or not according to need. You remain silent, sensing that here, silence is its own kind of answer. The fire shifts again, and with its movement, something ancient stirs. Not a presence, but a weight. You feel the press of stories that haven't been spoken aloud in decades, maybe centuries, lingering in the stones beneath your seat. These walls are not listening. They are remembering. The third figure, who has remained still until now, lifts a narrow staff from beside his cushion and places it across his lap. The wood is dark with age and handling, carved with symbols that seem to shift in the firelight. His gaze doesn't meet yours. It stays fixed on the flame, as if the answers he seeks lie in the way it curls and leans. When he speaks, his voice is deeper, slower, but no less deliberate. Xerxes burns bright, he says, and the words seem to make the fire itself lean forward, listening. Brightness that illuminates, that reveals, that commands attention across continents. But brightness consumes, and behind every brightness, shadows stretch long. The brighter the flame, the deeper the darkness it casts. He pauses, letting his words settle like smoke in still air. Brightness fades, shadows endure. They carry the shape of what cast them long after the light has moved on. They ask you nothing about what you've seen in the palace above. No questions about the Queen's garden, where politics disguise themselves as domestic concern, or the ledger of eunuchs, where human lives are reduced to inventory. Nothing about the satrap's games, or the schools behind the veil. They already know these things, or perhaps they simply don't need confirmation. Knowledge here is not gathered, but recognized. Instead, the man with ash-stained hands reaches beneath his robe and produces a square of parchment. It is perfectly blank, cream-colored, with a slight texture that speaks of careful manufacture. He holds it out with reverence, not as an offering, but as a test, a challenge, a gift whose value can only be determined by the receiver. "This is your ember," he says, and his voice carries the weight of ritual. "Write only what memory demands. Not what happened, but what remains. Not what was seen, but what was felt." You hesitate, but not because you're uncertain. You hesitate because you understand exactly what this act means. Anything written here doesn't become record. It becomes root. It doesn't circulate through the palace or instruct future generations. It lingers. The ink becomes smoke, and the smoke becomes part of the fire's breath, part of the chamber's memory. You take the parchment, and for the first time, you realize how heavy blankness can be. One of the figures produces a reed pen and a small pot of ink, not the formal black used for official documents, but something darker, richer, that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. You write, not facts, not events, not the careful judgments that fill official reports. You write moments. You describe the scent of cedar smoke clinging to scrolls, carried too quickly through a war tent, the way urgency can be smelled as well as seen. You describe the quiet tension of a silver bowl placed on a cushion during a council meeting where no voices were raised. Yet everything changed, the weight of unspoken decisions hanging in air, thick with unvoiced thoughts. You write of a mirror room where power stood barefoot and unguarded, where the most powerful man in the known world allowed himself to be vulnerable in reflection. You write of a garden where a whisper spoken over ripe figs altered the course of a province, where the sweetness of fruit and the bitterness of political necessity mingled on the evening air. You do not name names. You do not point fingers or assign blame. You let the details be enough. Let them carry their own weight of truth. The reed moves across the parchment, with surprising smoothness, as if the words were already there, waiting to be revealed rather than created. When you finish, the parchment is taken without flourish. The man with stained fingers folds it once, carefully, and places it into the flame. It burns without ash, without smoke, without the usual crackling protest of paper meeting fire. Instead, it seems to dissolve into light, to become part of the flame's essence. The smoke that rises is barely visible, curling high into the dome above, and vanishing into shadows that seem to welcome it home. What is burned here is not lost, says the constellation-robed figure, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. It is remembered differently, not as fact, but as truth, not as history, but as understanding. They speak then of the deeper chambers, vaults, and caverns that extend beneath the palace, beyond the reach of maps or memory. These are not tombs, they explain, though they hold the remains of things that have died. They are not vaults, though they preserve what is precious. They are echoes turned solid, reverberations of decisions and conversations that have gained enough weight over time to take physical form. Beneath every empire lies a root network, the second figure explains. Decisions that were never recorded, conversations that shaped the course of nations, but left no trace in official histories. This is one of the places where such roots grow. The silent figure finally moves, rising and motioning toward a recessed arch you hadn't noticed before. You follow him into a chamber smaller still, barely large enough for 3 people to stand comfortably. No fire burns here, only the reflected glow from the main chamber. In the center stands a pedestal of dark stone. On it rests a sealed jar, its bronze lid engraved with script so fine you cannot tell where word ends and symbol begins. You sense this jar is not merely an object, but a threshold. It holds not an artifact, but a decision. Not information, but potential. This is opened only when thrones shift, says the man, his voice barely above a whisper. It breathes once for each ring, takes the measure of the air, tastes the moment, decides what wisdom the new order needs to hear. You do not ask what is inside. The contents don't matter so much as the moment when it's opened. What matters is the breath it takes, the way it tastes the air of a changing world, and decides what, if anything, should be whispered back into the ear of a new ruler. You return to the main chamber. The fire is lower now, not dying, but settling into a deeper rhythm. Your role here is finished, not dismissed, but completed. The understanding passes between you without words. You are free to go, welcome to stay, but no longer needed for the evening's purpose. Back in the corridor, the bronze lions still hold their gaze, but their silence feels different now. Like 2 old scribes who have already read what you wrote and chosen not to comment, not from disapproval, but from understanding. You are no longer a stranger in this part of the palace. The palace above has dimmed fully into shadow. The halls flicker with torchlight, but the chatter of the day is gone. Even the fountains seem to trickle more slowly, their songs softer, more contemplative. The marble beneath your feet carries warmth from the fire chamber with you, tucked into your soles like a memory that refuses to cool. As you walk, you notice the palace no longer feels like a single massive entity. Instead, it feels layered, complex, like a poem written in multiple languages simultaneously. Not one structure, but many realities stacked atop one another. The visible and the whispered, the hidden and the remembered, the recorded and the true. You do not feel small within it anymore. You feel aligned, like a note that has found its proper harmony within a larger composition. Not powerful in the way of kings, but present in the way of witnesses. Not chosen for greatness, but awakened to significance. Your chambers wait ahead, dimly lit by the same lamps as always. But tonight, their glow feels like a closing line in a letter, not final but soft, completing a thought that began when you first felt the pull toward the bronze lions. A comma in a sentence the palace has been writing for generations. You stand at the threshold, hand resting on the wooden frame. Tonight it feels different. Not just a boundary between public and private space, but between who you were this morning and who you have become. You look back once more down the corridor, trying to memorize the path back to that deeper understanding. The halls behind you are empty now, their silence complete. The mirrors have settled into stillness. The bronze lions maintain their eternal watch. And deep beneath the marble, the embers continue to burn, low, steady, eternal. They do not seek warmth or light. They seek only to remember. And now, as the fire's last glow slips from your conscious thoughts, and the stillness gathers fully around you like a familiar cloak, you prepare to settle into the quietest part of all, the part where words end and the hush of history holds you close, where understanding deepens into wisdom in the patient darkness of rest. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the velvet hush of the Queen's mirror room to the scorched bridges stretched across the Hellespont, from silver bowls placed on silent cushions to the fire that remembers what marble walls forget, it's been a long, slow walk through the veiled chambers and whispered corridors of a vanished empire. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the scent of burning cedar and the quiet game of satraptius, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole idea. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly dive into ancient history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. Drop it in the comments. It's always wonderful to see how far these quiet journeys can reach. For now, I'll let the palace fall silent, the torches fade to embers, and the wind slip softly through the columns of Persepolis. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.